I was walking home late, the kind of late where even the drunks had mostly staggered off the streets. It was just me and the occasional street lamp, their yellow light pooling in faint circles that flickered like they couldn't decide whether to stay on or give up entirely. The silence was dense, the kind you could almost feel in your lungs, and for some reason, I took a different route home that night. Not on purpose, but because my feet just veered left at the corner instead of going straight. It wasn't a shortcut. If anything, it added a few extra minutes. This street was quieter, darker, lined with houses that looked like they were holding their breath. The only sound was the faint scrape of my sneakers on the pavement. I wasn't scared exactly, but there was something about the stillness that made me keep glancing over my shoulder, like the shadows might start following me if I wasn't careful. That's when I saw it. A vending machine. It stood alone at the edge of the sidewalk, unlit, slightly crooked, as though it had been dropped there by accident and no one had bothered to move it. I wouldn't have given it a second glance if it weren't for one thing. It didn't belong there. There was no storefront nearby, no gas station, no alley where someone might have dumped it. Just this vending machine in the middle of an empty street. I walked up to it, more out of curiosity than anything else. Up close, it looked old, the kind of old where the plastic buttons had gone yellow and the metal edges were flecked with rust. The glass panel on the front was smeared with fingerprints, or maybe smudges from something else, and the selection inside wasn't quite right. No candy bars, no sodas, just stuff. A pocket watch, a single shoe, not even new, just lying there like someone had lost it and the machine had scooped it up. A small glass jar filled with what looked like sand. A Polaroid picture, face down so you couldn't see what was on it. No prices, no labels, just a dull red slot for coins and those yellowed buttons, each one marked with a faint number. I leaned in, trying to make sense of what I was looking at, and then I heard a voice behind me. "Do you have change?" I spun around, nearly dropping my bag. There was a man standing a few feet away, close enough that I should have heard him approach, but I hadn't. He was wearing an oversized coat, his hands stuffed deep into the pockets, his face shadowed by the brim of a hat. Yeah, I think," I stammered, reaching instinctively for my pocket. He didn't move closer, didn't say anything else, just stood there watching me, like he was waiting for something. I pulled out a couple of coins and held them up, unsure if he wanted them or was just making conversation. He nodded toward the vending machine. "Use them." For some reason, I didn't argue. Maybe it was the way he said it, calm but insistent, like he already knew I was going to listen. I turned back to the machine and slid the coins into the slot. They clinked as they disappeared inside, the sound oddly muted. Nothing happened at first. I hesitated, then pressed one of the buttons at random. 7. The machine whirred to life with a groan, the kind of noise that made me think it hadn't been used in years. Something thudded into the tray at the bottom. I crouched down and pulled it out. It was a single playing card, the Queen of Hearts. I turned it over in my hand, expecting to find some kind of explanation, but it was just a card, slightly worn around the edges. The red ink faded like it had been sitting in the sun for too long. When I straightened up, the man was gone. I glanced around, but the street was empty again, the shadows undisturbed. It was like he'd never been there at all. I looked down at the card, still warm in my hand, as if it had been sitting out in the sun for hours instead of inside a vending machine in the middle of the night. For some reason, I took it home. I don't know why. It wasn't valuable. It wasn't useful, but it felt important. Not in a loud, obvious way, but in a quiet, nagging way, like it was asking me a question I didn't know how to answer. The next day, I found myself staring at it again, turning it over and over in my hands. That's when I noticed the tiny mark. It was faint, almost invisible against the pattern on the back of the card, but it was there. A small black spiral, inked into the corner. I didn't know what it meant, but I couldn't stop looking at it. The thing is, the card wasn't the only thing. Over the next few weeks, I started finding other objects. A marble in my coat pocket that I knew I hadn't put there. A brass key lying on my kitchen counter. A slip of paper tucked into a library book I'd never checked out, with the words "Look closer" scrawled in a handwriting I didn't recognize. At first, I thought it was a coincidence. A series of random, unrelated moments. But they weren't random. They couldn't be. Each item had the same black spiral, hidden somewhere small. Etched into the key, painted onto the marble, barely visible in the corner of the slip of paper. I still don't know what they mean. The vending machine wasn't there when I went back. The street was empty, just cracked pavement and silent houses. But every now and then, late at night, I dream about it. About the man, the machine, the strange, impossible objects behind the glass. And when I wake up, I feel the weight of the Queen of Hearts in my hand, even though I know it's sitting in a drawer across the room. You ever feel like the world's trying to tell you something? Like it's leaving you breadcrumbs, but the trail doesn't lead anywhere you recognize? Like there's a story happening around you, and you're the only one who doesn't know the ending? There's a crack in the sidewalk near my apartment, just outside the little bakery that always smells like warm cinnamon and yeast. I pass it every day, but last week I noticed something strange. Someone had planted a tiny garden in it. Not a random tuft of grass or the occasional dandelion, but an actual, intentional garden. There was a miniature sunflower, no taller than a pencil, a sprig of lavender, and a single strawberry plant with one small, perfectly red berry hanging from its stem. The whole thing couldn't have been more than 6 inches wide, but it was arranged so carefully that it stopped me in my tracks. The first day, I figured it was just some quirky art project, like the yarn-bombed stop sign down the street, or that mailbox painted to look like Van Gogh's Starry Night. But the next day, the sunflower was gone. In its place was a tiny fern, the kind you might see in a forest, delicate and curling. The lavender stayed, but the strawberry plant had grown a second berry, just as red and round as the first. No sign of anyone around, no tools, no footprints. Just this quiet, evolving garden in the crack of a sidewalk. By the third day, I was hooked. I started taking a longer route to work just so I could pass by it and see what had changed. The fern had vanished, replaced by a cluster of tiny blue flowers I couldn't name. The lavender was still there, and the strawberry plant was thriving. It had 5 berries now, all glistening with dew in the morning light. I crouched down to get a closer look and noticed something even stranger. Around the edges of the crack, where the concrete met the soil, there were little etchings. Tiny symbols that looked almost like runes, carved so finely that I had to squint to make them out. I decided to wait and see who was responsible. That evening, I brought a folding chair and a thermos of tea and set up camp across the street, pretending to read a book but really just watching that crack like a hawk. For hours, nothing happened. The bakery closed, the streetlights came on, and the smell of cinnamon gave way to the scent of wet asphalt as the night cooled. I was starting to feel foolish when, just past midnight, I saw movement. It wasn't what I expected. I'd been imagining some kind of eccentric gardener, an older person with a floppy hat, maybe, or an art student with paint-stained hands. What I saw instead was smaller, much smaller. At first, I thought it was an animal, like a squirrel or a bird, but as it moved into the glow of the street lamp, I realized it wasn't an animal at all. It was a figure, no more than 6 inches tall, carrying what looked like a watering can made from the shell of an acorn. I froze. It wasn't fear, exactly. More like the kind of awe that pins you in place, the kind you feel when you see something you're not sure you're supposed to see. The figure moved quickly, with a sense of purpose, tending to the little garden with meticulous care. It sprinkled water on the lavender, plucked a wilting petal from one of the blue flowers, and gently brushed dirt away from the base of the strawberry plant. Then it knelt down by the edge of the crack and started carving something into the concrete with what looked like a shard of obsidian. I couldn't help myself. I stepped out from my hiding spot and crossed the street, moving as quietly as I could. The figure didn't notice me at first, too absorbed in its work. But as I got closer, I must have made some noise. A scuff of my shoe against the pavement, or the clink of my thermos against my hip, because it froze and looked up. Its face was shadowed, but its eyes caught the light, gleaming like chips of onyx. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then, faster than I could react, it darted away, disappearing into the shadows. I called out, something stupid like, "Wait," but it was gone. I looked back at the garden, half expecting it to have vanished too, but it was still there, as serene and perfect as ever. The next morning, I went back to the crack. Everything was gone. The lavender, the strawberry plant, the blue flowers, gone. Even the soil had been swept clean, leaving nothing but the bare concrete and those tiny etchings, now faded almost to invisibility. It was as if the garden had never existed. I haven't seen the figure again, but I can't stop thinking about it. Who, or what it was. Why it chose that spot. What the runes meant. I've started looking for other cracks in the sidewalk, other places where something might be hidden. Every time I pass a patch of wildflowers growing where they shouldn't, or see a tuft of moss sprouting between bricks, I wonder if it's the same handiwork. I've even started carrying a notebook, jotting down symbols when I think I see them, though none of them seem to match. And the strangest part? That little patch of sidewalk outside the bakery doesn't feel the same anymore. It's just a crack now, an ordinary imperfection in an ordinary street. But every time I walk past it, I feel a twinge of something, like an itch just under the skin, like the air is waiting for something to happen. So now, I have to ask, have you ever stumbled across something that felt like it wasn't meant to be part of this world? Something small and fleeting, but impossibly real? Something that made you question what you thought you knew about the cracks and things? Last Friday, I found myself sitting in a laundromat even though I have a perfectly functional washer and dryer at home. Let me explain. I'd overloaded my machine, trying to save time, and the spin cycle retaliated by staging a dramatic protest. An ear-splitting clang followed by a whine that sounded like a dying robot. It gave up entirely, leaving me with a soaking pile of towels and the realization that I had no idea how to fix it. So there I was, hauling my damp laundry across town to the only laundromat I could find that was still open past 9. The place was a little too fluorescent for comfort, the lights buzzing faintly in a way that made me feel like I was on the set of some low-budget dystopian film. There was a vending machine with ancient-looking snacks, rows of humming washers and dryers, and one other person, an older guy in a tattered flannel shirt, folding his clothes methodically at the far end of the room. He didn't look up when I walked in, and I was grateful for that. I wasn't in the mood for small talk. I shoved my towels into a machine that looked like it had seen several wars, fed it a handful of quarters, and sat down on one of those uncomfortable plastic chairs to wait. My phone was dead, of course, because why not? So I just stared at the washer as it started to churn. There's something hypnotic about watching laundry spin. It's like staring into a portal of fabric purgatory, socks and shirts tumbling in endless loops. I must have zoned out, because I didn't notice the noise at first. It was a faint scratching, just at the edge of hearing. I glanced around, expecting to see the older guy messing with something, but he was gone. The room was empty except for me, the vending machine, and the machines quietly humming along. The scratching grew louder. It was coming from behind me, near the wall where the vending machine stood. For a moment, I considered leaving. I mean, strange noises in an empty laundromat? That's how horror movies start. But then curiosity got the better of me. I stood up and walked toward the vending machine, half expecting to find a rat or some other unfortunate creature trapped in its metal guts. But there wasn't a rat. There wasn't anything. The scratching stopped as soon as I got close. I crouched down, peering under the machine, but there was nothing there. Just dust bunnies and an old gum wrapper. I straightened up, feeling a little ridiculous, and was about to walk away when I noticed something odd. The vending machine wasn't plugged in. It had a cord, sure, but the cord was dangling loose, not connected to the wall. Yet the machine was lit up, humming faintly, the little row of candy bars and chips perfectly illuminated. I stared at it, confused, before reaching out to press one of the buttons. A 4. Snickers. Nothing happened. I tried another button. Still nothing. And then, just as I was about to step back, the machine whirred. It wasn't like the sound a normal vending machine makes. It was deeper, slower, almost like a growl. The light inside flickered, and the scratching sound started again. Louder this time, more insistent. I took a step back, my pulse quickening. This was not normal. Machines don't growl. Machines don't scratch. I was about to bolt when I saw it. Something moving inside the vending machine. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light. But no, there was definitely movement, something small and shadowy darting behind the snacks. My first thought was mouse, but then the light flickered again, and for just a split second, I saw it clearly. It wasn't a mouse. It was a hand. A tiny, clawed hand, reaching out from behind the Snickers bar. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The hand disappeared, and the scratching stopped. The machine was silent now, its light steady, humming softly as if nothing had happened. I took another step back, my heart pounding, and then, I kid you not, the machine spoke. Not words, exactly, but a sound, low and guttural, like a chuckle. It sent a shiver down my spine. Okay, I whispered to myself. No, we're done here. I grabbed my half-dry towels out of the washer, shoved them into my bag, and practically sprinted out the door. I didn't care if they were dripping wet. I wasn't staying another second in that place. As I stepped outside into the cold night air, I looked back at the laundromat, half expecting to see the vending machine glowing ominously through the window. But it just sat there, quiet and unassuming, like any other vending machine. I almost convinced myself I'd imagined the whole thing. Almost. When I got home, I hung my damp towels around the apartment and tried to forget about it. But the thing is, I can't. The sound, the hand, the way the machine growled like it was alive. It won't leave my head. I keep thinking about that vending machine, about what might be hiding inside it, about how it wasn't plugged in. And here's the weirdest part. When I checked my bag the next morning, there was a Snickers bar in it. I didn't buy it. I didn't even touch the vending machine long enough for anything to fall out. But there it was, sitting on top of my towels, its wrapper slightly torn, like it had been clawed open. I haven't gone back to that laundromat, and I'm not planning to. But every time I pass a vending machine now, I feel this little twinge of unease, like it's watching me, like it knows. I can't explain it, and honestly, I'm not sure I want to. So tell me, what's the weirdest thing that's ever happened to you? Something you couldn't explain, no matter how hard you tried? The rain fell sideways, a relentless curtain of water that soaked me to the skin. I'd taken the wrong turn somewhere. Of course, I had. And now I was stumbling through an overgrown trail that seemed to lead nowhere. Every step sank into the mud, and every branch that whipped across my face seemed to laugh at me, mocking my decision to come here alone. I wasn't running away, not exactly. More like pausing my life. A solo retreat into the woods to find myself, or whatever nonsense I'd convinced myself would happen. But the cabin was still miles away, and my phone was dead, and I was beginning to think finding myself would have to wait until I wasn't lost. Then I saw it. A house, or at least the suggestion of one, looming through the trees. The edges were indistinct in the rain, but it was definitely there, tall and narrow and angular. The kind of place you don't see in guidebooks. The kind of place that looks wrong simply because it exists. I almost turned back. Almost. But the promise of shelter outweighed the gnawing unease in my gut. So I pushed forward, fighting through brambles and wet leaves until I was standing on its porch. The wood was slick, darkened by years of rain, and the front door stood ajar, swinging slightly in the wind. I called out, "Hello?" But the sound of my voice was swallowed immediately by the storm. Stepping inside felt like stepping into another world. The air was dry and warm, though I hadn't seen any smoke rising from a chimney. The floor creaked underfoot, but the house was immaculate, the kind of place that should have smelled of mildew but didn't. The walls were lined with bookshelves, and the furniture was old but polished, as though someone had just finished cleaning. A single lamp glowed faintly in the corner, casting long, soft shadows. It felt lived in, but there was no sign of anyone. No coats by the door, no dishes in the sink. Just silence, deep and heavy. I should have left then. The unease was growing, pressing against my ribs like a second heartbeat. But curiosity tugged at me, the way it always does, and I moved deeper into the house, my footsteps muted on the thick rugs. The books caught my attention first. They were strange. No titles on the spines, just symbols etched into the leather. When I pulled one from the shelf, the pages were blank, smooth and unmarked. I opened another. Same thing. I tried a third, then a fourth. All empty, but their weight felt substantial, as though they were full of something I couldn't see. I almost didn't hear the whisper. It was faint, like the rustling of leaves, and at first, I thought it was the wind. But then it came again, more distinct, threading through the silence like a needle through cloth. Stay. I spun around, heart pounding, but the room was empty. The shadows seemed longer now, pooling in the corners like ink. I stepped back, bumping into the bookshelf, and a book toppled to the floor, landing with a soft thud. When I picked it up, the cover was different. This one had a title, though the words shifted when I tried to focus on them, as though the letters were alive. I opened it cautiously, half expecting another blank page, but this one wasn't empty. The ink was dark and uneven, as though written in haste. It wasn't a story or a journal, but a list, each line a single name. At the bottom of the page, there was a space where a name had been started but not finished, the ink trailing off like a breath caught mid-sentence. I closed the book, my hands shaking, and placed it back on the shelf. Is someone here? I called out, my voice louder now, bordering on panic. The house didn't answer, but the air seemed to shift, growing heavier, thicker. I turned to leave, but the doorway wasn't there anymore. The hallway stretched impossibly long, fading into shadow, and the rain outside had turned into a muffled roar. My pulse hammered in my ears as I moved toward the hallway, my steps quick and uneven. Every door I passed was slightly ajar, revealing rooms that seemed normal at first glance. Bedrooms, a study, a kitchen, but each one felt subtly wrong. The angles were too sharp, the proportions too perfect. It was like walking through a painting that hadn't quite dried. And then I saw her. She was standing at the end of the hallway, her back to me, her head tilted slightly as though listening for something. Her dress was pale, almost glowing, and her hair fell in long, dark waves. Hello? My voice cracked, the sound trembling in the charged air. She didn't move. I took a step closer, then another, each one feeling heavier than the last. Are you okay? Do you live here? Her head turned slightly, just enough for me to see the edge of her face. A sharp cheekbone, a sliver of an eye. It wasn't the eye itself that froze me. It was the way it looked at me, unblinking, as though it knew me, knew everything. She whispered something, too soft for me to hear, and when I stepped closer, the hallway seemed to collapse, the walls rushing inward like the closing of a throat. The air disappeared, the light disappeared, and for a moment, there was nothing but the sound of my own heartbeat. When I woke, I was outside, lying in the mud. The house was gone. The trail behind me overgrown as if it had been untouched for years. In my pocket was a book. No title, no symbols, just smooth leather. I haven't opened it yet. I'm not sure I ever will. I don't even know why I went into that thrift store. I had no real purpose for being there. It was one of those places with that strange mix of smells. Old leather, mothballs, maybe a hint of spilled coffee that had seeped into the floorboards years ago and never quite left. The kind of store that always felt a little too quiet, even when there were people shuffling around, holding up worn jackets or turning over chipped mugs like they were deciphering a secret code. I was just killing time, wandering between mismatched shelves and racks of forgotten lives, when I saw it. At first, I didn't understand why it made me stop. It was just a mug, a plain, faded thing with a cartoon bird painted on it. The bird was wearing a little aviator cap, one wing raised as if mid-salute, and the words, "Fly high," were scrawled underneath in a peeling blue font. There was a chip near the rim, and the handle had a faint crack running through it, but it didn't feel like just any old mug. My chest tightened in a way that was both sudden and oddly familiar, like the sensation of hearing a song you hadn't realized you still knew by heart. I picked it up without even thinking, turning it over in my hands. It was heavier than I expected, and there was a faint scratch along the bottom where someone had scrawled initials in permanent marker, MK. I didn't recognize the initials, but I recognized the mug. Or at least, I thought I did. A hazy image drifted up from the depths of my memory, a snapshot I hadn't touched in years. I was 7, maybe 8. It was early morning, the kind where the air felt thick and slow, sunlight cutting through the kitchen blinds in golden slats. My dad was at the table, his hair sticking up in wild tufts, wearing a t-shirt he'd obviously slept in. The mug was in his hand, the same bird grinning up at him from beneath his fingers as he sipped coffee that smelled too bitter for me to ever want to try. I used to call it his lucky mug because he always drank from it before important things, job interviews, presentations, the time he decided to tackle fixing the lawnmower. "This mug's got magic," he'd say, winking at me over the rim. "It's got the kind of power you can't explain, only trust." I believed him, of course. When you're a kid, magic doesn't need proof. I'd sit across from him at the table, swinging my legs and waiting for the moment he'd set the mug down. Then I'd lean over and peer into the dark swirl of his coffee like I might catch a glimpse of whatever mysterious force lived inside. He never explained the mug's origins. It just existed, as if it had always been there. A quiet talisman in a chaotic world. Somewhere along the way, though, the mug disappeared. I don't remember exactly when. It must have been during the blur of my teenage years, when mornings with my dad at the kitchen table gave way to rushed breakfasts eaten with headphones on, conversations replaced by the hum of static between us. I hadn't thought about that mug in years, but now, holding it in my hands, I felt like I'd stumbled across a piece of him I didn't know I'd been missing. The thing is, my dad's still around. I could call him right now if I wanted to. Hear his voice, probably ask him about the mug and get some long-winded story about where it came from. But the truth is, we don't talk much these days. Not because of any dramatic fallout or lingering resentment, just the slow drift that happens when life pulls you in different directions. And yet, standing there in the thrift store with that chipped, worn mug in my hand, I felt closer to him than I had in years. I carried it to the counter without hesitation. The cashier barely looked at me as she rang it up, rattling off a total that felt almost insulting in its insignificance. $2.50 for something that held an entire era of my childhood. A lifetime of mornings spent believing in magic. When I got home, I rinsed the mug carefully, running my fingers along its cracked handle as if it might crumble under my touch. Then I poured myself a cup of coffee. Not the sugary, watered-down kind I usually drink, but the strong, bitter brew my dad used to make. I sat at the table and held the mug just as he used to, letting the warmth seep into my palms. The cartoon bird grinned up at me, its paint faded but its salute as cheerful as ever, and I smiled back like an old friend had just walked through the door. I sipped the coffee slowly, staring out the window as the light shifted across the walls. I don't know if it was the taste or the feel of the mug in my hands, but something about it unlocked a version of myself I hadn't felt in years. The kid who believed in Lucky Charms and breakfast table rituals, who thought her dad could do anything as long as he had that mug in his hand. Later that day, I did something I hadn't done in far too long. I called my dad. When he picked up, his voice was a little hoarse, like he'd been caught off guard. "Hey," I said, before I could overthink it. "Do you remember that old mug you used to have? The one with the bird on it?" There was a pause, and I could hear the faint crackle of the line as he breathed in. "The fly-high mug?" he said, his voice softening. "Of course I remember. That thing was my good luck charm for years. I thought it got lost when we moved. I found it," I said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "At a thrift store. It's here with me." He laughed, a deep, genuine laugh that I hadn't heard in too long. "Well, I'll be damned. I always told you it had magic, didn't I?" And for the first time in years, I believed him. Have you ever found something, a little thing, a forgotten thing, that felt like it reached across time to remind you of who you used to be? Something that made you pick up the phone, or sit a little longer, or smile at a memory you thought you'd lost? The first time I saw him, he was building a ladder to nowhere. It was late afternoon, that hour when the sunlight turns heavy and gold, and the world feels caught between one breath and the next. I was walking back from the bus stop after another long day at a job I barely tolerated when I spotted him in the empty lot at the edge of the neighborhood. It had always been a forgotten space, overrun with weeds and the occasional stray cat. People tossed old furniture there sometimes. Broken chairs, rusted bed frames, a cracked TV, but nobody ever lingered. But there he was, standing in the middle of it like he belonged, surrounded by wooden planks and a scattering of tools. He was tall and wiry, with a face that looked like it had been chiseled out of stone and forgotten before the details were finished. His hair was a mess of grays and whites, and his hands moved with an efficiency that seemed almost hypnotic as he hammered two pieces of wood together. I slowed my pace, trying not to look obvious as I stared. The ladder he was building was strange. The base was wide, like a pyramid, but as it rose, it narrowed sharply, climbing higher and higher into the air. By the time I got close enough to see clearly, it was already taller than he was, and still growing. "Hey," I said, my curiosity getting the better of me. "What's that for?" He paused, glancing over his shoulder. His eyes were startlingly blue, like a summer sky seen through cracked glass. "It's a ladder," he said simply, like that explained everything. "I can see that," I replied, stepping closer. "But where's it going?" He turned back to his work, lifting another plank. "Up," he said. I waited for him to elaborate, but he didn't. Just kept hammering, his movements deliberate and precise. The air smelled faintly of sawdust and something else I couldn't place, something sharp and metallic. I stood there for a moment longer, feeling awkward and out of place, before finally giving up and walking away. That should have been the end of it, just a passing encounter with an eccentric stranger. But the next day, the ladder was still there, and it had grown. It now towered over the lot, its spindly frame swaying slightly in the breeze. The man was back too, perched halfway up, tightening bolts with a wrench. I couldn't help myself. I crossed the street and called up to him. "Don't you think it's a little unsafe?" I asked, gesturing to the way the whole structure seemed to tremble. He didn't look down. "Safety's a relative concept," he said, his voice calm and even. "That's not very reassuring," I muttered. He chuckled, the sound low and rough, like stones grinding together. "You worry too much." For reasons I couldn't explain, I started visiting him every day after work. He was always there, working tirelessly, his ladder stretching higher and higher into the sky. It should have collapsed under its own weight, but somehow it didn't. The materials he used seemed random: wood, metal, even bits of glass and plastic. But the way he assembled them was almost elegant, like he was weaving something instead of building it. I asked him his name once, but he just shrugged and said it didn't matter. "Names are for people who need to be found," he said. "I'm not one of them." "Well, what do I call you then?" "Whatever you want." I decided to call him Lark, mostly because it seemed to annoy him. As the weeks went by, I started to notice things, small, inexplicable things that made my stomach twist in ways I didn't understand. The ladder's shadow didn't always match the angle of the sun. Sometimes, when the wind blew, it sounded like it was whispering, even though there was no one around. And then there were the birds. They started gathering around the ladder, first a few crows, then sparrows, then flocks of starlings that swirled and darted like living smoke. They perched on the rungs, their black eyes glinting in the light, watching Lark work with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "What's with the birds?" I asked one evening. "They're curious," he said. "About what?" He paused, looking at me like I was the one being ridiculous. "About what's at the top." I didn't know how to respond to that, so I didn't. The ladder kept growing. By the end of the second month, it was so tall that the top disappeared into the clouds. I hadn't even realized how strange that was until I tried to explain it to someone at work. "There's no clouds today," they said, giving me a strange look. But when I went back to the lot, the clouds were there, swirling like fog around the upper rungs. Lark was more cryptic than ever. He started humming while he worked, low, melodic tunes that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. One day, I found a feather stuck to my sleeve, a long, silver feather that shimmered like moonlight. "Where's this from?" I asked, holding it up. Lark glanced at it, his expression unreadable. "Higher up," he said. "Higher up where?" "Where the birds go when they leave." The next day, he wasn't there. The lot was empty, except for the ladder, which now seemed impossibly tall. I craned my neck, trying to see the top, but it was lost in the haze. A strange stillness hung over the place, like the whole world was holding its breath. I waited for hours, but Lark never came back. That night, I dreamed about the ladder. I dreamed I was climbing it, my hands gripping the rungs, my feet slipping against the wood. The air grew colder as I ascended, and the sky turned dark, filled with stars I didn't recognize. When I reached the top, there was no platform, no destination. Just the endless expanse of the universe stretching out in every direction. And then I fell. I woke up gasping, my heart pounding in my chest. For a moment, I thought I could still hear the whisper of the wind, the flutter of wings. But when I looked out the window, the ladder was gone. The lot is empty now, just a patch of dirt and weeds like it always was. Sometimes, though, when the light hits it just right, I think I can see faint marks in the ground, like the ghosts of where the ladder's legs once stood. And sometimes, if I stand there long enough, I swear I can hear the birds calling from somewhere far above, their voices sharp and wild, as if they're laughing at a joke only they understand. I'm not entirely sure why I took the painting. It wasn't mine, I didn't need it, and it definitely wasn't the kind of thing you could justify as an impulse grab, like stealing a candy bar from the checkout line. But there I was, standing on the sidewalk outside the community center, holding a giant canvas with a crooked, abstract swirl of colors that looked more like someone's migraine than art. The day hadn't been particularly unusual. I was walking home from work, already debating whether I could justify ordering pizza again, when I noticed a group of people milling around the community center's front lawn. They'd set up a long table with a hand-painted sign that read, "Free Art." Behind it, stacks of old canvases and wooden frames leaned precariously, their colors faded from years of neglect. I wasn't planning to stop, but as I walked past, I caught sight of this one painting, a riot of messy, overlapping shapes in reds, yellows, and purples. It didn't look like anything in particular, but there was something about it that made me pause. Maybe it was the way the colors seemed to hum against each other, like they were vibrating on the edge of my vision. Or maybe I just needed an excuse to procrastinate going home. An older woman sitting behind the table noticed me staring. "Take one," she said, waving her hand like a magician revealing her latest trick. I pointed at the painting. "This one?" "Sure," she said. "It's free. Just don't use it as a dartboard." I smiled politely, though in hindsight, I probably should have asked some follow-up questions, like where these paintings had come from, or why they were free in the first place. But instead, I thanked her, picked up the canvas, and continued on my way. Carrying the painting felt awkward, like trying to walk a very stubborn, flat dog. The wind kept catching it, threatening to knock me off balance, and I almost gave up halfway home. But for some reason, I didn't. I hauled it up the stairs to my apartment, leaned it against the wall by the couch, and stared at it while I ate cold leftovers straight out of the container. That night, I dreamed about the painting. In the dream, the colors swirled and moved like they were alive, shifting into shapes I couldn't quite make sense of. I felt like I was falling into it deeper and deeper, until I woke up gasping for air. The room was dark, but I could just make out the shape of the painting leaning against the wall, the edges of its colors barely visible in the moonlight. For the next few days, I tried to ignore it. I told myself it was just a painting, a random piece of junk I'd picked up because I was bored. But every time I walked past it, I felt a strange pull in my chest, like it was asking me to look closer. Eventually, I gave in. I dragged the painting onto the coffee table and sat down in front of it, studying every inch of the canvas. Up close, the colors were even more chaotic, smudges and streaks that didn't seem to follow any kind of pattern. But as I stared, I started to notice something. Hidden within the swirls were faint outlines, almost invisible, like they'd been painted over long ago. I leaned closer, squinting, and suddenly, the shapes came into focus. A house, a tree, a figure standing in the foreground, their face blurred but unmistakably human. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at the hidden image, but eventually, I noticed something else, a small, raised edge near the bottom corner of the canvas. I picked at it, and to my surprise, the top layer of paint peeled away like old wallpaper. Beneath it was another painting, completely different from the abstract mess on the surface. This one was darker, both in color and in tone. It showed a stormy sky over an empty road, the horizon swallowed by shadows. In the distance, a faint outline of a car was barely visible, its headlights glowing like tiny eyes. The whole thing felt wrong. Not just unsettling, but actively wrong. like it was looking back at me in a way that made my skin crawl. I couldn't stop staring. The longer I looked, the more I noticed. The way the shadows seemed to shift when I moved, the faint lines in the clouds that almost looked like faces. My heart started to race, and I had to remind myself to breathe. It was just a painting, just oil and canvas. But then the lights in my apartment flickered. I froze. The room went silent, the hum of the fridge cutting out mid-cycle. For a split second, the air felt heavy, like the pressure just before a thunderstorm. And then, just as quickly as it happened, everything went back to normal. The lights came back on. The fridge hummed to life. I looked back at the painting. The car in the distance wasn't there anymore. I backed away slowly, my mind racing to come up with a rational explanation. Maybe I'd imagined the car. Maybe the painting had always been just the stormy road and nothing else. But deep down, I knew better. I shoved the canvas into my closet and closed the door, trying to convince myself it wasn't worth thinking about. For the next few days, I avoided that part of the apartment entirely. I slept with the lights on. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that it was just a painting, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Finally, after a week of restless nights, I decided I couldn't keep it. I hauled the painting out of the closet, marched downstairs, and left it by the dumpster. I didn't care if someone else took it or if it ended up in a landfill. I just wanted it gone. That night, for the first time in days, I slept deeply. The next morning, as I was leaving for work, I saw it. The painting was propped against my front door, the swirling colors staring back at me like they were laughing. I moved out a month later. Here's my question. Have you ever brought something into your life, an object, a choice, a person, thinking it was harmless, only to realize it carried more weight than you were prepared for? And what did you do when it wouldn't let go? I didn't go to the laundromat to make friends. It was the kind of place where the fluorescent lights buzzed. The vending machine was always out of Sour Patch Kids, and the dryers only worked when they felt like it. I'd been coming there for 6 months, every Sunday morning, because my apartment didn't have a washer. And in that time, I'd perfected the art of avoiding unnecessary human interaction. Headphones in, book open, eyes down, just me, my socks, and my growing resentment for quarters. It was a slow morning, just me and a guy folding jeans in the corner. I was midway through transferring my wet clothes into the dryer when I heard the front door slam open. "Oh, thank God. People," a voice announced dramatically. I looked up. A girl stood in the doorway, holding a cardboard box with a very deliberate, "This side up," scrawled across it in marker. She was soaking wet, like she'd just walked through a car wash. Her hair plastered to her face, her shoes squelching with every step. "Hi," she said, out of breath. "I need help." I blinked at her. The guy in the corner blinked at her. No one moved. She sighed, exasperated, and plunked the box down on the nearest table. "Look, I'm not a serial killer or anything. I just need someone to hold the box while I dry my clothes." I should have gone back to minding my business, but curiosity won. "What's in the box?" I asked, because I've seen enough movies to know you should always ask. "Not a head," she said immediately, which didn't inspire confidence. "Here." She turned the box slightly, and that's when I heard it. A faint, high-pitched sound, like chirping. "Ducklings. Ducklings," I repeated, as if saying it out loud would make it less ridiculous. She nodded. "I found them by the river. Their mom's gone, probably hit by a car. So now I'm their mom. And they're cold, and I need to dry my hoodie so they don't freeze." I glanced at the guy in the corner, hoping for some kind of backup, but he was suddenly very invested in folding his socks. "So, you're washing your clothes with a box of ducks?" "Ducklings," she corrected. "And yes, do you have a better plan? Because I'm all ears." I didn't. So, against my better judgment, I grabbed the box and peeked inside. Sure enough, 6 tiny, shivering ducklings were huddled together in a makeshift nest of wet hoodie fabric. They were absurdly small, all fuzzy yellow and blinking black eyes, and for some reason, they didn't seem nearly as alarmed by this whole situation as I was. "Are you sure this is hygienic?" I asked, looking at the washers. "They were in the river," she pointed out, as if that made everything fine. "Nature's washing machine." I couldn't argue with that kind of logic. She shoved her hoodie into the nearest washer, threw in a couple of quarters, and turned back to me. Okay, you hold them. Keep them warm. Don't drop them. Oh, and if they poop, try not to let it get on your clothes. Before I could protest, she handed me the box and marched off to the vending machine, leaving me with 6 quacking responsibilities and no instructions. They weren't bad company, honestly. A little loud, a little squirmy, but endearingly helpless in a way that made me feel oddly protective. The girl, whose name, I learned later, was Tessa, came back with a bag of pretzels and sat cross-legged on the floor like we were camping. She told me how she'd been walking her roommate's dog when she spotted the ducklings huddled on the riverbank. I couldn't just leave them, she said, tearing a pretzel in half and nibbling on it. But now I have 6 ducklings and no idea what I'm doing. I wanted to ask if this was the weirdest thing that had ever happened to her, but something told me it wasn't. By the time her hoodie was dry, we'd worked out a plan. I had no idea what ducklings ate or where you were supposed to keep them, but Google did. Tessa decided she'd set up a little enclosure in her bathroom until she could find someone more qualified to take them. In the meantime, I agreed to help her carry the box back to her car because, as she put it, ducklings are a 2-person job. Walking out of the laundromat with a box of chirping ducklings felt like some kind of fever dream. People stared. A guy at the bus stop asked if we were making soup. Tessa just laughed, her wet hair sticking to her face, and said, "Nope, just saving the world one ridiculous situation at a time." When we reached her car, a tiny, beat-up hatchback that barely looked roadworthy, she opened the back door and carefully placed the box on the seat. Then she turned to me and grinned. "Thanks for not running away screaming," she said. "Most people would have bailed." "It's not every day you get roped into a duck rescue," I admitted. "True," she said, pulling out her phone. "You're officially my duck accomplice now. Want to exchange numbers? In case they need a godparent or something?" I hesitated for a second, then nodded. Why not? If life was going to throw ducklings at me, I might as well lean into it. We didn't save the world that day. We didn't even do anything particularly meaningful in the grand scheme of things. But for some reason, it felt like we'd pulled off some small, improbable miracle, turning a laundromat full of strangers into a place where ducklings could find warmth and 2 people could find a story worth telling. A week later, I got a text from Tessa with a picture of the ducklings waddling around her bathtub and a caption that read, "Still alive. You're officially a godparent. Hope you're ready for the responsibility." I wasn't, but I didn't mind. Have you ever had a moment so strange it felt like it belonged in a sitcom, but somehow it left you smiling for days? When I was 24, I accidentally became the caretaker of a feral peacock. Not by choice, obviously. Who in their right mind would willingly adopt an animal that screams like a banshee and fights its own reflection? But life has a way of dropping weird things in your lap, and for 6 months, that weird thing was a bird named Ramon. It happened during the weird in-between phase of my life, the kind of stretch where you're technically an adult but feel like someone's handed you the controls to a spaceship with no manual. I was living in a drafty rental house out in the sticks, trying to save money after grad school while I figured out what to do with my sociology degree besides regret it. The house was part of a cluster of old farm buildings, surrounded by overgrown fields and crumbling barns. It was charming in the kind of way that makes you overlook things like mice in the walls and faucets that only work if you pray first. My nearest neighbor was a retired couple named the Kleins, who mostly kept to themselves except to occasionally shout at deer for eating their garden. I first saw Ramon about 2 weeks after I moved in. I was standing in the kitchen, attempting to make coffee while dodging the colony of ants that had claimed my counter, when I looked out the window and saw something. At first, I thought it was a weirdly colorful turkey. Then it turned and unfurled this ridiculous fan of shimmering blue-green feathers, and I dropped my coffee mug right there on the floor. I'd never seen a peacock in real life before, and my brain briefly refused to believe it was just wandering through my backyard like it had someplace to be. The Kleins later told me that the bird had belonged to the previous tenant, a hobbyist who'd apparently decided that raising exotic animals was a good idea until it wasn't. Ramon had been left behind when they moved, presumably because no one knew what to do with a feral peacock in rural Ohio. He'd been haunting the area ever since, showing up randomly in yards and fields like a brightly colored ghost. For the first few weeks, I mostly avoided him. Peacocks, it turns out, are not the majestic creatures you'd imagine. They're loud, aggressive, and surprisingly large when you're face to face with one. Ramon spent his days patrolling the property, occasionally screaming for no apparent reason. At night, he'd roost in a tree near my bedroom window, which meant I got to enjoy his banshee wails at 3 a.m. on a regular basis. He was, objectively, the worst kind of roommate. And then, one morning, he followed me to my car. I had a job interview that day, something corporate and dull that I didn't really want but felt obligated to pursue. I was running late and trying to juggle a folder of resumes with a granola bar when I noticed Ramon trailing me. He didn't try to attack or anything. He just walked behind me, this weird, lumbering shadow, stopping when I stopped and tilting his head like he was judging my life choices. I tried shooing him away, but he just stood there, unimpressed. Eventually, I got in my car, thinking that would be the end of it. It wasn't. Ramon, in an act of bird logic that I will never understand, decided to climb onto the roof of my car. And then he refused to get down. I sat there in the driver's seat, staring at his spindly bird feet through the sunroof, and wondered if this was some kind of karmic punishment. I honked the horn, yelled at him, even tried bribing him with crackers from my glove compartment, but he wasn't budging. I ended up missing the interview, which I told myself was fine because the job probably would have sucked anyway. Ramon eventually hopped down of his own accord, strutting off like he'd won some invisible battle. After that, things shifted. I don't know if it was Stockholm Syndrome or if I just spent too much time alone in that house, but I started to get used to him. He was still a menace, of course, but he was my menace. I'd leave out scraps of bread for him in the mornings, and he'd repay me by screaming less often. I caught him pecking at his reflection in my car door once, and decided to just give him a mirror to save the paint job. He loved that mirror. By the way, I'd find him sitting in front of it for hours, puffing up and turning his head like a vain little prince. There was one particularly bad storm that summer, the kind that sends you to the basement with a flashlight and a sense of impending doom. When it finally passed, I stepped outside to check the damage and found Ramon soaked and bedraggled, huddled under the picnic table like some sad, soggy feather duster. Without thinking, I grabbed an old towel and went out to him. To my surprise, he didn't run or try to peck me. He just stared at me with this wide, alien bird gaze as I draped the towel over him. That was the first time I thought, maybe we're in this together. But like all weird phases of life, that summer eventually came to an end. I found a better job in the city, packed up my things, and said goodbye to the house with its drafty windows and haunted plumbing. The Kleins agreed to keep an eye on Ramon, though I suspect they secretly hoped he'd wander off for good. As I loaded the last box into my car, Ramon appeared one last time, standing in the middle of the driveway like he knew what was happening. "Stay out of trouble, okay?" I told him, feeling ridiculous for talking to a bird. He squawked in response, a sound that could have meant anything or nothing. And then he walked away. I think about Ramon more often than I should. Sometimes I wonder if he's still there, strutting through the fields and fighting his reflection. Other times, I like to imagine he's moved on, found a flock or another backyard to haunt. What I know for sure is that I'll never look at peacocks the same way again. So, here's my question. Have you ever found yourself unexpectedly bonded to something or someone you never thought you'd care about? Something strange, inconvenient, maybe even a little bit annoying, but that somehow managed to leave an impression anyway? I'd love to hear your stories. It was the orange of all things that threw me. A perfectly round, glowing orb of citrus perched delicately on the edge of my kitchen counter. I don't buy oranges. I don't even particularly like oranges. And yet, there it was, as though it had always belonged, casting a faint shadow against the chipped tile backsplash in the soft morning light. I stopped mid-step, halfway to my coffee maker, and just stared at it. My first thought, absurd as it was that maybe someone had broken into my apartment in the middle of the night and left it there. A calling card, perhaps, from the world's most whimsical burglar. But the door was locked, the windows untouched, and my cat was still curled up on the couch, utterly indifferent to the mystery unfolding a few feet away. I walked over and picked it up. It was cool and firm in my hand, its dimpled skin slightly sticky as though it had just been plucked from a tree. I turned it over, inspecting it for signs of some kind of prank or explanation. A note taped to the bottom? A tiny GPS tracker embedded in the peel? Nothing. Just an orange. I placed it back on the counter, poured myself some coffee, and tried to ignore it. But you can't just ignore something that shouldn't exist in your space. It's like when you see a single shoe lying on the side of the highway. It's not just the shoe that bothers you. It's the absence of everything else. The rest of the story. Where's the other shoe? How did it get here? Why does it feel like a message you can't quite understand? Over breakfast, I kept sneaking glances at the orange, as if it might decide to move when I wasn't looking. By the time I was halfway through my cereal, I'd talked myself into believing it wasn't that strange. Maybe I'd grabbed it at the grocery store without thinking, absent-mindedly plopped it on the counter, and then forgotten about it. That made sense. Sort of. Except it didn't. I'd gone grocery shopping 3 days ago, and my shopping list had been embarrassingly basic. Eggs, milk, bread, coffee, and a frozen pizza for those inevitable, I don't want to cook nights. I would have remembered buying an orange. Wouldn't I? I shook it off. Life's full of tiny mysteries. Socks go missing in the laundry. Keys end up in the fridge. You move on. That's what I told myself. Anyway, as I rinsed out my coffee mug, grabbed my bag, and headed out the door. The orange was still on the counter when I got home that evening. I don't know what I was expecting. Maybe for it to disappear as inexplicably as it had appeared. But it stayed, stubborn and bright, as though daring me to acknowledge it. That's when things got stranger. I picked it up again, and this time, I noticed something I hadn't before. There was a small black dot near the top, no bigger than a pinprick. I scratched at it with my nail, thinking it might be dirt, but it didn't budge. It wasn't dirt. It was ink. I leaned in closer, squinting. It wasn't just a dot. It was a symbol, tiny and intricate, so small I had to hold it up to the light to make it out. It looked like a spiral, but not quite. The edges were too jagged, the lines too deliberate, like it was meant to mean something. Okay, I said out loud to no one in particular. What the hell? I grabbed my phone and took a picture of the orange, zooming in on the symbol until it filled the screen. I ran a reverse image search, half expecting nothing to come up. But something did. It was an obscure emblem from an equally obscure myth I'd never heard of before, linked to some half-forgotten Mediterranean cult from centuries ago. I skimmed the first article in confusion. The symbol supposedly represented cycles or returns, the idea that nothing ever truly disappears, that everything is always on its way back, even when it seems gone forever. That's when my phone buzzed. A text. Unknown number. Did you find it? I stared at the message, my stomach doing a little flip. Another buzz. Unknown number. The orange. I looked around my apartment, half expecting to see someone watching me through the window, but there was no one. The curtains were drawn. The only sound was the hum of the fridge. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. Me. Who is this? A pause. Then, unknown number. It's yours. You know that, don't you? At this point, I should have called someone, the police, a friend, maybe even a therapist. But instead, I did something I can't fully explain. I cut the orange open. The second the knife sliced into it, the smell hit me. Not the sharp, tangy scent of citrus, but something darker, heavier, like wet earth after a storm, mixed with the faintest trace of smoke. The inside of the orange was black, not rotten, not moldy, just black, like ink or charcoal, smooth and solid and utterly wrong. And in the center, nestled where the seed should have been, was a small brass key. I stared at it, my brain trying and failing to catch up. The key was old, its surface worn smooth, the kind of thing you'd expect to find in a dusty attic or a shipwreck, not inside a piece of fruit. My phone buzzed again. Unknown number. You can leave it now, or you can find out. I didn't respond. I didn't even think. I just picked up the key, still sticky with the juice, or whatever it was, and held it in my palm. It felt heavy, heavier than it should have. The thing is, I didn't throw it away. Not the orange, not the key. I kept them both. The orange is still in my freezer, frozen solid, and the key is in a drawer by my bed. I don't know what it opens. Maybe I don't want to know. But sometimes, late at night, I take the key out and hold it, just to feel its weight again. And I wonder if it's waiting for me to figure out where it belongs, or if it's already decided that I do. You ever find something that feels like it's not just yours, but that it was always meant to be yours? Something you didn't ask for, but can't seem to let go of? Something that might be holding on to you just as much as you're holding on to it? The carnival appeared overnight, in the middle of a vast, empty field that had been barren for as long as anyone could remember. No signs announced its arrival. No trucks or workers were seen setting it up. One day, the field was empty, and the next, the tents stretched up toward the sky, their fabric shimmering like oil on water. Dylan saw it on his way home from his night shift, the Ferris wheel glowing faintly in the pre-dawn light. He slowed his bike, blinking in disbelief. There was something unnerving about how quiet it was. No music, no laughter, just the stillness of something waiting. When he told his roommate about it later that morning, Jess's reaction was immediate. A carnival? Out there? You're kidding. She leaned against the counter, coffee mug in hand. Not kidding. It's just there. Dylan rubbed the back of his neck. No signs, no flyers. Nothing. Let's go, Jess said, her eyes lighting up with mischief. What else are we doing today? By afternoon, the two of them stood at the edge of the field. The carnival was even stranger up close. The rides gleamed as though freshly polished. But the ticket booth looked weathered, its paint peeling. A single attendant sat inside, an old man with pale eyes and a bowler hat tilted at an odd angle. Welcome, the man said, his voice gravelly. Admission is free, but every game has a cost. Jess raised an eyebrow. What kind of cost? The man smiled, showing teeth that were too white, too sharp. The kind you won't miss. At first. Cryptic, Jess muttered, but she tugged Dylan's arm. Come on, let's check it out. The air inside the carnival was thick, heavy with the scent of candied apples and ozone. Children's laughter echoed faintly, though no children were visible. The first game they came across was a ring toss, manned by a woman in a sequin dress. Her eyes glittered, a shade too bright to be natural. Jess tossed her coins onto the counter. The woman's smile widened. The game is simple, she said, her voice lilting. 3 rings for 1 prize. If you win, you'll gain something you didn't know you needed. And if I lose? Jess asked, her tone playful. The woman leaned closer. Then you lose something you didn't know you'd miss. Jess rolled her eyes but picked up a ring. She missed the first throw, but her second ring landed perfectly. The third wobbled on the edge of a bottle before sliding off. The woman clapped her hands once, and a small velvet box appeared on the counter. Jess opened it to reveal a silver key. Cool, she said, tucking it into her pocket. What's it for? You'll find out, the woman replied cryptically. Dylan hesitated as Jess moved to another game. The carnival felt wrong. It wasn't just the 2 perfect rides or the way the sky seemed darker here, even in daylight. It was the way the air felt alive, as though the place were watching them. At the next booth, Jess won a locket shaped like a heart. At another, she earned a slip of paper with a single word written in ornate script. Home. Dylan refused to play, though the attendants watched him with knowing smiles. He stayed close to Jess, who seemed buoyant with excitement, unaware of how the prizes seemed to be accumulating weight in her pockets. Her laughter grew louder, more frenetic. As night fell, the carnival transformed. The lights burned brighter, casting jagged shadows that danced like living things. The laughter that had echoed faintly throughout the day now sounded distorted. The joy in it warped into something sinister. Jess's pace slowed. She clutched the silver key in one hand and the locket in the other, her expression clouded. I feel strange, she said, her voice unsteady. Dylan grabbed her arm. We should leave. They turned back the way they came, but the path twisted, unfamiliar. The carnival seemed to shift around them, the tents and rides rearranging like pieces on a chessboard. The air grew colder, the scent of burnt sugar turning acrid. When they finally found the entrance, the old man in the ticket booth was waiting. His pale eyes gleamed in the dark. You've played your games, he said, his voice smooth now, almost kind. And you've won your prizes. But nothing here comes without a cost. What does that mean? Jess demanded, her voice shaking. What did I lose? The man chuckled softly. "You'll remember soon enough." He tipped his hat and gestured toward the field. The carnival behind them flickered, the rides and booths dissolving into shadows. The walk home was silent. Jess clutched her prizes tightly, but her excitement had turned to unease. When they reached the apartment, she unlocked the door with the silver key. The locket fell from her pocket as she stepped inside, the clasp popping open. Inside was a photograph of her as a child, standing beside a woman Dylan didn't recognize. "Who's that?" he asked, pointing. Jess stared at the photo, her face pale. "I don't know," she whispered. Over the following weeks, the gaps in Jess's memory grew. First, small things. A childhood pet she couldn't recall, a teacher she swore she'd never had. Then larger pieces began to vanish. The face of her first love, the sound of her mother's voice. The prizes remained, scattered around the apartment like silent witnesses. Dylan tried to help her piece things together, but the more they searched, the more elusive the memories became. Jess stopped laughing. She stopped going outside. One night, Dylan woke to find her standing in the living room, clutching the silver key. She turned to him, her eyes empty. "I think it's time to go back," she said. The next morning, Jess was gone. The key and locket sat on the kitchen counter, but she was nowhere to be found. Dylan returned to the field, but it was empty, the grass unbroken as if no carnival had ever been there. The prizes remained, quiet reminders of the night they couldn't undo. The forest had no official name. It wasn't on any map, and most people didn't even realize it existed. It was just a patch of trees tucked between the hills, too small and unremarkable to attract hikers or adventurers. If you asked the locals, they'd shrug and say it was just another stretch of woods, the kind you see everywhere. But if you asked me, I'd tell you it was alive. Not in the way forests are normally alive, with rustling leaves and the scurrying of animals, the soft groan of branches swaying in the wind. No, this forest was something else entirely. You didn't notice it at first, not when you walked in. It looked normal enough. The ground was covered in a spongy layer of moss and fallen leaves, and the trees stood tall and straight, their trunks mottled with patches of lichen. But if you stopped, really stopped, you could feel it, a faint hum, like the place was breathing. I only found it because I'd taken a wrong turn on a road trip. My GPS had stopped working miles back, and I'd been driving in circles, following increasingly sketchy roads, hoping they'd lead me to a highway. When I finally gave up, I pulled over next to what looked like an old service road, just wide enough for a single car. I thought I'd stretch my legs, clear my head, maybe figure out how I'd managed to get so hopelessly lost. That's when I saw it. The entrance wasn't marked. It was just a gap in the trees, wide enough to walk through, the ground sloping gently downward. There was something oddly inviting about it, the way the sunlight filtered through the leaves, casting dappled patterns on the path. It was quiet, too, the kind of quiet that settles on you like a heavy blanket. No cars, no voices, just the distant trill of birdsong. I don't know why I walked in. I wasn't much of a nature person, and I was already stressed from the day. But something about that gap in the trees pulled at me, like it was asking me to step inside. So I did. The air changed the moment I crossed into the forest. It was cooler, thicker, with a faint, earthy scent that reminded me of wet stone and pine needles. The trees grew closer together as I walked, their branches intertwining above me to form a canopy that blocked out most of the light. It wasn't dark, though. There was a faint glow coming from somewhere, a soft, golden light that seemed to have no clear source. It flickered like candlelight, shifting and swaying as I moved deeper into the woods. That's when I noticed the markings. At first, I thought they were natural, knots and scars on the bark of the trees. But as I looked closer, I realized they were too deliberate, too precise. Swirling patterns carved into the trunks, like spirals and runes, some so faint they were barely visible, others so deep I could run my fingers along their grooves. They weren't random, either. Each tree had its own unique design, and the closer I looked, the more it felt like the carvings were telling a story, one I couldn't quite understand. The hum I'd felt earlier grew stronger. Not louder, exactly, but more present, like it was wrapping itself around me. It wasn't menacing, though. If anything, it felt warm, protective, like the forest was welcoming me. I didn't realize how far I'd walked until I reached the clearing. It was small, just a circle of open space surrounded by trees. In the center stood a stone pillar, about waist-high, its surface worn smooth by time. The golden light was brighter here, pooling around the base of the pillar like liquid sunlight. I walked toward it slowly, my steps crunching softly on the mossy ground. The hum had become a vibration, thrumming faintly in my chest, like my heartbeat was syncing with the rhythm of the place. There was something resting on top of the pillar. At first, I thought it was a rock, but as I got closer, I saw it was a jar. A simple glass jar, no bigger than a coffee mug, with a cork stopper wedged into its mouth. The jar was filled with a shimmering, silvery substance, like liquid mercury, but it moved in a way that didn't seem entirely liquid. It pulsed, shifting and swirling, as though it was alive. I didn't touch it. Not yet. I just stood there, staring at it, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The air around me felt electric, charged with something I couldn't name. And then, without thinking, I reached out. The moment my fingers brushed the jar, everything changed. The hum erupted into a low, resonant tone that vibrated through my entire body, shaking the ground beneath me. The golden light flared, blindingly bright, and I stumbled back, my hand flying to my eyes. When the light dimmed, I saw the jar had changed. The silvery substance inside was gone, replaced by something darker, like ink or shadows. It swirled violently, pressing against the glass as though it was trying to escape. I heard a voice then, not with my ears, but inside my head, soft and echoing, like a whisper carried on the wind. "You've taken it." I spun around, expecting to see someone, but the clearing was empty. The forest was silent, the hum gone. The jar was still in my hand, warm and heavy, its dark contents churning restlessly. I wanted to put it back, to leave it on the pillar and walk away, but something inside me wouldn't let go. I left the forest without remembering how. One moment, I was in the clearing, clutching the jar. The next, I was back at my car, the trees behind me silent and still. The jar sat on the passenger seat as I drove, its contents faintly glowing now, casting shifting shadows on the upholstery. That was 3 weeks ago. The jar hasn't stopped glowing. It sits on my desk, humming faintly, and sometimes, when the room is quiet and I'm alone, I swear I hear whispers. I don't know what I took, or why the forest let me take it, but sometimes, late at night, I catch myself staring into the jar, and I feel the strangest sensation. Not fear, but anticipation. Like whatever's inside it is waiting for me to figure out what to do next. The first time I saw him, he was painting the side of a train car. Not spray painting like graffiti artists, though I think even they would have admired the precision, but using a small brush, his strokes methodical and deliberate. The image was almost finished by the time I noticed it. A black sun hung low over a fractured horizon, the cracks in the earth glowing faintly red, as if alive. It looked like something pulled from a dream, or maybe a nightmare. I stood there longer than I meant to, watching him work. His face was lean, hollowed like someone who hadn't slept in days, and his hands moved with a strange kind of grace, the brush barely lifting from the surface. He didn't look up, didn't seem to notice me at all. I wasn't sure if I should speak or just keep walking, but something about him pinned me in place. "Beautiful, isn't it?" His voice startled me, low and rough like gravel underfoot. I cleared my throat. "Yeah, it's haunting." He turned then, his eyes locking onto mine with unsettling intensity. "It's not meant to be beautiful," he said. "It's meant to be true." Before I could ask what that meant, he dropped the brush into a small jar of murky water and climbed down from the platform he'd rigged against the train. Without another word, he walked past me and disappeared into the shadows of the freight yard. I didn't tell anyone about the encounter, mostly because I didn't know how to explain it. The image stayed with me, though, surfacing in quiet moments like a stray thought I couldn't shake. A week later, I went back to the train yard, half hoping to find him there again. He wasn't, but the painting was gone. Not painted over or washed off. Gone, like it had never been there. The train car was the same dull gray as the others, its surface unmarked. I ran my hand across it, as if touching it might uncover some hidden layer, but it was smooth and cold under my palm. Looking for something? His voice came from behind me, and I spun around to find him standing a few feet away, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. He held a new canvas under one arm, the edges wrapped in stained burlap. "What happened to the painting?" I asked, ignoring the way my voice trembled slightly. He tilted his head, as though the question amused him. "It wasn't for this place. It moved." "What does that mean?" "It means you're asking the wrong questions." I frowned. "And what's the right question?" He considered me for a moment, then set the canvas down on the ground and began unwrapping it. The burlap fell away, revealing another painting, this one of a dense, tangled forest lit by an eerie green glow. There was a figure in the center, barely discernible through the underbrush, but its eyes were unmistakable, pale, empty, and staring directly at me. I took an involuntary step back. "What is this?" "It's where you're going," he said simply, as if that were an answer. "Listen, I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but it's not a game." His voice was sharper now, cutting through my protest. "The paintings, they don't just show what's seen. They show what will be seen. What must be seen." I shook my head, trying to make sense of his words. That's not possible." "Not for you," he said, bending to pick up the canvas again. "Not yet." Before I could stop him, he turned and began walking away, his long coat trailing behind him like a shadow. I didn't follow. I couldn't. Something about his tone, his presence, made it clear this wasn't an invitation. But I couldn't let it go either. Over the next few days, I searched for him. At the train yard, in alleyways, even online. Nothing. It was as if he'd vanished, leaving only his paintings behind. Or maybe not even that. The forest painting haunted me, not just in my memory but in my dreams. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, the glow of that eerie light still seared into my vision, the sound of unseen things moving through the trees echoing in my ears. Then, one morning, it wasn't just a dream. The painting was in my living room, propped against the wall where my old bookshelf used to be. The bookshelf, along with everything it held, was gone, as if it had never existed. I stared at the canvas, my mind struggling to comprehend how it had gotten there, or how it was even real. The glow seemed to pulse faintly, almost imperceptibly, as if the light within the painting was alive. And the figure in the center, it was closer now. I could see more details. The shape of its face, the lines of its body, the unmistakable reflection of my own features. I didn't sleep that night, or the next. By the third day, the painting had changed again. The forest was gone, replaced by a desolate field under a blackened sky. The figure was still there, still me, but now it was standing at the edge of something vast and terrible. A city, maybe, though its towers twisted in ways that defied logic, their silhouettes jagged and wrong. The next day, I packed a bag and left my apartment. I didn't know where I was going, only that I couldn't stay. But no matter how far I drove, no matter how many miles I put between myself and that painting, the image followed me. It was there when I closed my eyes, in every shadow and reflection. I haven't seen him again, the man with the brush and the hollow eyes. But I know he's out there, painting something new. And whatever it is, it's waiting for me. The first sign that something was different about today was the vending machine in the office break room. It wasn't broken. That would have been normal. The thing was usually on the fritz, swallowing dollar bills and spitting out cryptic error messages. But today, it worked perfectly. Too perfectly. I punched in the code for a bag of pretzels, and instead of the usual mechanical groaning, the machine responded with a soft, polite ding. Then it spoke. "Are you sure that's what you want?" The vending machine asked, its voice smooth and professional, like a customer service rep with too much patience. I blinked. "What?" "The pretzels," it said, the bag already halfway to the bottom of the machine. "Are you absolutely sure that's your choice? It's an important decision." It's just a snack," I said, glancing around the empty break room to make sure no one else was witnessing this absurd conversation. The vending machine hummed thoughtfully. "There's no such thing as just a snack," it said. Every choice ripples outward. A bag of pretzels today could lead to a life-altering moment tomorrow. Or not. Hard to say. I stared at the machine, half expecting someone to jump out from behind a corner and yell, "Gotcha!" But no one did. The machine stayed silent, its words hanging in the air like an uninvited guest. "Okay," I said slowly. "What would you recommend then?" The machine hummed again, as though considering my question very seriously. Finally, it said, "The peanut butter crackers." I frowned. "I don't even like peanut butter crackers." "Do you trust me?" it asked, which felt like a loaded question coming from a vending machine. "Not particularly." "Fair," it said, sounding almost amused. "But I think you should try them anyway." Against my better judgment, I hit the button for the crackers. The machine made that same polite ding and dispensed the package with a kind of deliberate care, as though it were handing me a rare artifact. When I bent down to retrieve it, I noticed something strange. The slot where the snacks fell wasn't dark and shadowy like usual. It was glowing faintly, a soft, golden light spilling out from somewhere deep inside the machine. I reached in cautiously, expecting to feel the cold plastic wrapper of the crackers, but my fingers brushed against something else. A piece of paper. I pulled it out and unfolded it, revealing a handwritten note in neat, looping script. "Today, you will be asked a question. Answer carefully. Everything depends on it." My stomach twisted, and I looked around the break room again, but it was still empty. The vending machine was silent now, as though nothing unusual had happened. I grabbed the crackers and the note, stuffed them into my pocket, and bolted for my desk. For the next few hours, I couldn't concentrate on anything. The note sat in my pocket like a secret waiting to explode, and every time someone approached me, I half expected them to blurt out some earth-shattering question. But no one did. The day dragged on like any other. Emails, meetings, awkward small talk. By the time I left the office, I'd almost convinced myself that the vending machine incident had been some bizarre stress-induced hallucination. But when I got home, the second note was waiting for me. It was taped to my front door, written in the same looping script. "Are you ready?" "Ready for what?" I muttered, pulling the note down and crumpling it in my hand. There was no answer, of course, just the sound of traffic in the distance and the faint hum of the streetlights overhead. Inside, my apartment was exactly how I'd left it, messy, but comfortably so. I kicked off my shoes, tossed the note onto the counter, and tried to shake off the lingering weirdness of the day. But then I noticed the peanut butter crackers sitting on the kitchen table, exactly where I hadn't put them. The package was open. One cracker was missing. "All right, very funny," I said, more to myself than anyone else. "If this is a prank, it's getting old." The crackers didn't respond, obviously, but the note on the counter did. I hadn't noticed it unfolding itself until now, the crumpled paper smoothing out as if by an invisible hand. New words appeared on the page, forming one deliberate sentence. "The question is coming." This was getting ridiculous. I grabbed my phone to call my best friend, Sarah, the only person I trusted to tell me if I was actually losing it. But before I could dial, the screen lit up with a notification. It wasn't a text or a call. It was just a single question, floating in the middle of the screen. "Would you trade it?" I froze. "What?" I said aloud, as if the phone could hear me. The question didn't change. It just sat there, waiting, impossibly heavy for such a simple phrase. "Trade what?" I asked. The phone didn't respond, but something inside me did. A memory surfaced, unbidden. Last summer, sitting in the hospital waiting room while my dad lay unconscious in the ICU. The beeping of machines. The sterile smell of antiseptic. The nurse saying, "There's nothing more we can do." I hadn't thought about that day in months. I didn't want to. But now the memory was sharp and clear, and I could feel the weight of it pressing down on me like it had never left. Would I trade it? "Yes," I whispered before I could stop myself. The phone screen blinked off. For a moment, everything was quiet. Then, slowly, the world seemed to shift. Not physically, but in a way I can't quite explain. Like a film reel slipping out of place. I sat down hard in the nearest chair, clutching the phone like it might anchor me to reality. When I looked up, the peanut butter crackers were gone, and the crumpled note on the counter had vanished. The world outside the window looked the same. My apartment felt the same. But deep down, I knew something had changed. And somewhere, far away, I think the vending machine was laughing. The town of Hollow Creek had one rule everyone knew: never visit the greenhouse after sunset. No one explained why, but the warning was stitched into the fabric of life there. Parents whispered it to their children as a bedtime mantra. Friends dared each other to break it but never followed through. And the elderly spoke of the rule with a mix of fear and reverence. The greenhouse stood at the edge of the woods, its glass panes cracked and clouded, vines creeping over its skeletal frame like veins on brittle skin. Tessa moved to Hollow Creek in late autumn, the air already sharp with the bite of approaching winter. She hadn't come for the charm of small-town life. She came because the rent was cheap and anonymity seemed easier here. People left her alone, mostly, though she could feel their eyes linger when she walked to the corner store or wandered the paths by the river. She first heard about the rule during a rare conversation with her neighbor, an older man named Grant who smoked cigars on his porch and spoke with a gravelly voice that seemed carved from stone. "You stay away from that greenhouse," he said, pointing his cigar at her like a weapon. "I see you running out there some mornings. Don't get curious." Tessa had nodded, brushing off his warning as the sort of folklore that clung to places like this. But the greenhouse intrigued her. Every morning on her runs, she passed it, its silhouette dark against the rising sun. The glass reflected her image in fragments, her face fractured and ghost-like. There was something magnetic about it, something that pulled at the edges of her rationality. She didn't plan to go there at night, not at first. But one evening, as she walked home from the store, her curiosity overpowered the whisper of caution in her mind. The moon was full, bathing the world in silver, and the greenhouse glimmered in the distance like a mirage. She hesitated at the edge of the woods, staring at its warped frame. There was no one around, no sound but the soft rustle of leaves. No one would know. The air grew colder as she approached, and the scent of damp earth and decay grew stronger. The vines covering the greenhouse writhed slightly in the breeze, or maybe they weren't moving at all. Her mind was already playing tricks. When she reached the door, she noticed it wasn't locked. The handle was cool under her fingers, and as it turned, the world seemed to hold its breath. Inside, the air was thick and heavy, warm despite the chill outside. Rows of plants stretched toward the cracked ceiling, their leaves vibrant in a way that felt unnatural. Some glowed faintly, their edges outlined in pale light. Others were black, their stems twisting into grotesque shapes. A faint hum filled the space, low and rhythmic, as if the plants were breathing. Tessa stepped carefully between the rows, her footsteps muffled by the soft earth. She reached out to touch one of the glowing leaves, but the moment her fingers brushed it, a voice echoed through the greenhouse. "Do not touch what does not belong to you." She spun around, heart hammering. No one was there. The voice came again, low and melodic, like wind weaving through a hollow. "You are not welcome here." Tessa's first instinct was to run, but her legs felt heavy, rooted to the ground. "Who's there?" she called, her voice trembling. The plants around her seemed to shift, their leaves curling and uncurling like hands. At the far end of the greenhouse, a figure emerged from the shadows. It wasn't human, though it wore a shape that mimicked one. A silhouette draped in vines and moss, its face obscured by petals that opened and closed like a blooming flower. Its eyes, if they were eyes, glowed with the same faint light as the plants. "You came unbidden," it said, "and now you are bound." "I didn't mean to," Tessa began, but the figure raised a hand, and her voice faltered. "Intent matters little," it said. "The greenhouse is a sanctuary, a prison, a gate. Those who enter after dark carry its weight." "What weight?" she demanded, though her voice was weak. The figure tilted its head. "You will know. In time." The vines that crept along the walls began to move, slithering toward her like living things. Tessa backed away, but they were faster, wrapping around her ankles and wrists. Their touch was cold and soft, like silk soaked in ice water. The figure watched as the vines tightened, its expression, or lack of one, impossible to read. When Tessa woke, she was lying on the grass outside the greenhouse. The moon had sunk low, and the first rays of dawn were breaking over the horizon. Her body ached, and her clothes were damp with dew. The greenhouse stood silent, its glass reflecting the soft pink of the morning sky. It looked ordinary now, abandoned and harmless. But something was different. As she stood, she noticed her shadow on the ground. It stretched unnaturally long, twisting and bending as though caught in an unseen wind. She turned, but there was nothing behind her, just the faint hum of the greenhouse echoing in her mind. When she walked back to her house, Grant was waiting on his porch, his cigar unlit. He looked at her shadow, then at her face, and his expression hardened. "I warned you," he said quietly. Tessa didn't reply. She didn't need to. She could feel the weight already, an ache in her chest, a pull at the edges of her thoughts. The greenhouse had marked her, and whatever it had given her, or taken, she knew it wasn't finished. In the days that followed, the shadow remained, always moving, always watching. And at night, when the world was quiet, she swore she could hear the hum of the greenhouse, calling her back. When I walked into my living room, there was a woman sitting on my couch, eating a bowl of cereal. That, in itself, was not the weirdest part. The weirdest part was that she looked exactly like me. Same face, same hair, even the same old college sweatshirt I only wear when no one's around. She was calmly munching away, as if she hadn't just shattered every natural law of existence. I said, frozen halfway through the doorway. "What are you doing here?" She glanced up at me, spoon halfway to her mouth, and said, "Oh, hey, you're back." Like I was the intruder in my own apartment. Then she set the spoon down in the empty bowl and added, "We need to talk, do we?" I asked, keeping one hand on the doorframe for stability because it felt like the floor was tilting beneath me, because I feel like I should be calling the police. Or maybe an exorcist. She rolled her eyes, my eyes, and stood up, stretching like she'd just woken up from a nap. "Relax. I'm not a ghost or a clone, or whatever you're thinking right now. I'm you. Well, sort of. I'm from about 3 weeks into your future." That's when I noticed the faint scar running along her left eyebrow. It wasn't there this morning when I'd brushed my teeth, but it looked old, like it had healed years ago. And her hair, my hair, was a little shorter, the ends uneven, like it had been cut in a rush. "Future me?" I said, taking a cautious step forward. "You expect me to believe that?" "Honestly, no," she replied, plopping back down onto the couch like she owned the place. "But I don't have time to convince you. So let's skip the existential crisis, okay? I need your help." "With what?" I asked, because apparently that's what you say to your own time-traveling doppelganger instead of running screaming into the night. She leaned forward, her expression suddenly serious. "Something bad is about to happen, and if we don't fix it now, everything's going to go sideways." "What kind of bad?" I asked. "Like, stubbed my toe bad, or end of the world bad?" "Somewhere in between," she said vaguely. "Look, I can't explain everything because, well, time travel rules. But let's just say it involves a key, a very angry man with a flamethrower, and an extremely fragile bottle of red wine." I stared at her, waiting for the punchline, but she looked completely serious. "You're kidding." "I wish I was." She stood up again, pacing the room like she was trying to remember something important. "Okay, here's what I can tell you. There's a key hidden in your kitchen, taped to the underside of the sink. You need to find it and keep it safe. No matter what happens, don't lose it." I blinked. "There's a key under my sink? Since when?" "Since 2 days from now," she said, pausing to shoot me a look. "But don't worry about that. Just get the key and, oh crap, hold on." Her hand flew to her pocket, and she pulled out a phone. It wasn't my phone, though. It was sleeker, shinier, and it lit up with an interface that looked like something straight out of a sci-fi movie. She frowned at the screen. "Damn it, I'm running out of time." "What do you mean, running out of time?" I asked, feeling the first stirrings of panic. "What happens if you—" Before I could finish the question, she started flickering. Not like a bad hologram, more like a candle flame in a strong wind. 1 second she was solid, the next she was translucent, and the next she was back again, her expression tight with urgency. "Listen to me," she said, her voice slightly distorted. "The key is the only thing that matters. Keep it safe, no matter what. And if you see a guy in a leather jacket with a scar on his hand, run." "Wait," I said, taking a step toward her. "You can't just—" But before I could stop her, she vanished. 1 second she was there, and the next she was gone, leaving nothing behind but the faint smell of burnt toast. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the empty couch and wondering if I'd finally lost my mind. Then, because apparently I've learned nothing about ignoring mysterious instructions from strange people, I went to the kitchen. Sure enough, there was a strip of duct tape under the sink, and stuck to it was a small, tarnished key. I held it in my hand, turning it over and over, trying to figure out what it could possibly unlock. It didn't look like anything special, just an old, slightly bent key you might find at a flea market. But as soon as I touched it, I felt something. A tiny spark, like static electricity, except it didn't hurt. It was more like the key recognized me, like it had been waiting for me to find it. That's when I heard the knock on the door. It wasn't a normal knock. It was heavy, deliberate, like someone was testing the strength of the wood. My heart leapt into my throat as I crept toward the door, key clutched tightly in my hand. When I looked through the peephole, I saw him, a man in a leather jacket, his hand resting casually on the door frame. I couldn't see the scar my future self had mentioned, but I didn't need to. Something about him radiated danger, like a wolf in sheep's clothing. He knocked again, this time louder. "I know you're in there," he said, his voice calm but chilling. "And I know you have the key." My blood ran cold. How did he know? How could he possibly? "I'm not going to hurt you," he said, as though reading my thoughts. "I just need to talk." I didn't answer. Instead, I backed away from the door, my mind racing. Future me had said to run if I saw him, but where could I go? He was standing right outside, and for all I knew, he wasn't alone. The knock came again, harder this time. "You're making this more difficult than it needs to be," he said, his voice losing its calm edge. "Just give me the key, and I'll be on my way." I looked down at the key in my hand, its tarnished surface gleaming faintly in the dim light. My future self's words echoed in my mind. "No matter what, don't lose it." Taking a deep breath, I turned and ran for the back door. Whatever this key unlocked, it was clearly more important and more dangerous than I could have imagined. And if future me was right, this was only the beginning. There's a moment I can't stop replaying, even though it lasted less than 10 seconds and was entirely unremarkable to anyone but me. It happened last week in my apartment. I was sitting on the couch, eating cereal out of a coffee mug, when the microwave beeped from across the room. The beep wasn't special. It was the same insistent tone it always makes when I leave something in there too long. But for some reason, I didn't stand up. I just stared at the microwave, and the microwave stared back, and I was struck by the absurd realization that the two of us were locked in a standoff. I could feel the machine judging me. It wasn't doing anything differently. It had no eyebrows to raise, no voice to shame me. But the beep carried a kind of smugness I couldn't ignore. I'd left a cup of tea in there, reheating for the 3rd time that afternoon because I always forget I've made tea until it's gone cold. The mug was probably spinning lazily inside, waiting for me to take some kind of action, but I just sat there with my cereal, feeling like the loser in a battle I didn't remember signing up for. The thing is, I'm not new to this. I've been leaving mugs in the microwave my entire adult life. I once discovered a forgotten cup of coffee in there 2 days later, at which point it had developed the kind of skin you usually see in low-budget horror films. But this time felt different. This time, it wasn't just about the tea. It was about the fact that the microwave felt alive in some small, irritating way, like a person tapping their foot impatiently while waiting for you to do something. It beeped again, and I said, "All right, I get it," out loud, as if it had ears. When I finally stood up and opened the door, the tea was sitting there in its mug like nothing had happened. No drama, no resentment, just tea. I took it out and brought it back to the couch, suddenly aware of how absurd the whole situation had been. But it stuck with me, this idea of the microwave as some kind of passive-aggressive roommate, always there, always beeping, always asking something of me. That night, I started noticing it with other appliances. My fridge, for example, lets out this low hum when it's running, and if you're not paying attention, it sounds almost disapproving, as if it's sighing at the state of its own contents, judging the wilted lettuce and questionable leftovers. My vacuum cleaner, on the other hand, sounds anxious, like it's working too hard and knows it's not doing a great job but is desperate to please. Even my toaster, my shiny, efficient toaster, seems smug when it ejects perfectly golden slices of bread, like it's saying, "See? I don't let you down." I don't think I'd ever stop to consider how much personality we assign to the objects around us. Maybe it's just a side effect of being human, our need to anthropomorphize everything so we don't feel alone. Or maybe it's because these things are so embedded in our lives, so constant, that they start to feel like characters in the story of our day. The microwave is the grumpy one. The vacuum is the overachiever. The fridge is the quiet, judgmental observer who knows all your secrets but says nothing. The next morning, I decided to test this theory. I left the apartment to run errands, but before I did, I said goodbye to my appliances as if they were pets. "Goodbye, microwave," I said, patting it gently. "Don't beep too much while I'm gone." Then I waved at the fridge. "Keep it cool." I didn't expect a response, obviously, but there was something comforting about it. This small, ridiculous ritual. It made leaving the apartment feel a little less mechanical, a little more alive. At the grocery store, I found myself wandering down the kitchen aisle, staring at new appliances with a kind of reverence. There were blenders with more buttons than a spaceship, air fryers that promised guilt-free French fries, and coffee machines that brewed everything from espressos to lattes at the touch of a button. They were sleek, modern, full of potential, but as I walked past them, I couldn't help but think they were missing something. None of them felt alive. Maybe it was the lack of history. They hadn't been there for late-night snacks or sick days or mornings where I was running too late to care how burnt my toast was. They were strangers, shiny and perfect, but ultimately hollow. On the way home, I stopped by a thrift store, half on a whim. I wandered through the aisles, past the mismatched mugs and stacks of dusty vinyl records, until I found a small shelf filled with old appliances. There was a blender missing its lid, a coffee maker with a cracked carafe, and at the very end of the row, a microwave. It was ancient, with yellowing buttons and a faint dent in its side. I reached out and pressed one of the buttons, and it made the saddest little beep I'd ever heard. I laughed, not because it was funny, but because it sounded tired, like it had been through a lot and just wanted to rest. I didn't buy it. I already had a microwave, and one passive-aggressive roommate was enough. But I thought about it all the way home, wondering who had owned it, what kind of meals it had heated, what stories it might have been part of. It was just a microwave, of course, but it had lived a life. And isn't that what we all want, in the end? To leave behind some trace of ourselves, even if it's just a dented appliance on a thrift store shelf? When I got home, I made tea. The microwave beeped at me, and for the first time, I didn't feel annoyed. "Thanks," I said, as I pulled the mug out and sat back down on the couch. I don't know if the microwave cared, but it felt good to say it. Like acknowledging a small, invisible friendship I'd been taking for granted. So now I'm wondering, do you ever feel like the things around you have personalities? Not just quirks, but actual moods, like they're alive in some tiny, silent way? Or is it just me, assigning meaning to beeps and hums because it makes the world feel a little less lonely? The house at the edge of town wasn't haunted, not in the way people usually mean when they say that. It wasn't covered in ivy or perched on a windswept hill. There were no boarded-up windows, no ghostly whispers in the night. In fact, it looked completely normal, perfect, even. Maybe that's why it felt so off. I didn't move to Marston because I wanted to. It wasn't some bold step into a new chapter of my life or a romantic attempt to find myself in a small town. It was necessity. I needed a fresh start, and Marston was the kind of place where nobody asked questions. Cheap rent, quiet streets, a nice enough coffee shop on the corner where you could sip something warm and pretend you had your life together. The house caught my eye on my second day in town. I wasn't looking for it. It seemed to find me. I was walking down Maple Street, trying to get a feel for the neighborhood, when I saw it. Pale yellow siding, crisp white shutters, a neatly trimmed lawn with a single magnolia tree in full bloom. It was the kind of house you'd see in a real estate ad with the words cozy and charming plastered underneath. But it wasn't the house itself that made me stop. It was the mailbox. It was old, much older than the house looked, and made of iron, painted a dull, chipped black. The kind of mailbox that looked like it should belong to a cottage in the woods, not a suburban street. What really caught my attention, though, was the name etched into the side, the caretaker. I remember standing there for a long moment, just staring at it. There were no other details. No address, no number, just those two words in elegant script. I figured it was some local joke I didn't understand yet, something quirky and quaint that would make sense in time. But when I asked the barista at the coffee shop about it later, her face changed. Not in an obvious way, just a flicker of something uncomfortable, quickly replaced by a polite smile. "Oh, that house," she said, wiping down the counter. "Nobody lives there. It's been empty for years." "Really?" It looked well kept. She hesitated, the cloth in her hand pausing mid-wipe. "Yeah, well, someone keeps it up, I guess." That was the end of the conversation. I didn't think much about the house after that. Life kept me busy, job interviews, unpacking, trying to pretend I had some sort of plan. It wasn't until a week later that I passed by it again. This time, the mailbox was open. I don't know why that struck me as odd. Mailboxes get opened, right? But something about it felt deliberate, like it was waiting for me. I should have kept walking. Any reasonable person would have kept walking, but I didn't. The inside of the mailbox was empty, except for a small envelope pressed flat against the back wall. No stamp, no return address, just my name written in neat block letters. I pulled it out, glancing around like I was expecting someone to jump out and accuse me of trespassing. The street was empty, quiet except for the faint rustle of leaves in the magnolia tree. The envelope was thick, heavier than I expected. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded carefully. "Welcome. If you're reading this, the house has chosen you." I don't know what I expected, but it wasn't that. I read the note again, my fingers tightening on the paper. My first thought was that it had to be some kind of prank. Maybe someone in town had seen me looking at the house before and decided to mess with the newcomer. But when I looked up, the house seemed closer. Not physically, of course. It was still sitting neatly on its lot, the yellow paint catching the late afternoon sun. But something about it felt more present, like it was leaning toward me, watching. I didn't tell anyone about the note, partly because I wasn't sure what to say, but mostly because I didn't want anyone to think I was crazy. I should have thrown it away, let it be a weird anecdote I tell years from now. But instead, I folded it neatly and tucked it into my jacket pocket. That night, I dreamed about the house. In the dream, I was standing in the front yard, staring up at it. The windows were dark, but I had the distinct feeling that something, or someone, was watching me from inside. The magnolia tree's branches stretched out unnaturally, their shadows curling across the lawn like fingers. I woke up drenched in sweat, my chest tight. It wasn't the dream itself that bothered me. It was the feeling that came with it, the sense that the house wasn't just something I'd seen, but something that had seen me. The next day, I went back. The mailbox was closed this time, but the door to the house was unlocked. I stood on the porch for a long time before I worked up the nerve to turn the handle. The door swung open easily, revealing a hallway lined with pictures. The photographs were black and white, each one framed in dark wood. They were of people, smiling couples, families gathered around picnic tables, children playing in fields. Ordinary scenes. But as I walked down the hall, I noticed something strange. In every photograph, there was a figure in the background. Always blurry, always just out of focus, but unmistakably there. The caretaker. I don't know how I knew it was them. Maybe it was the way they seemed to belong to the pictures and yet didn't. Maybe it was the way their presence felt familiar, even though I'd never seen them before. At the end of the hallway was a door. It was plain, unmarked, and slightly ajar. Beyond it, I could hear something faint, like a clock ticking, but slower, heavier, each tick echoing in my chest. I didn't go in. I couldn't. Instead, I turned and left, the sound of the ticking following me all the way out to the street. I haven't been back to the house since, but sometimes, late at night, I hear the ticking. It's faint at first, barely audible, but it grows louder the longer I ignore it. I've tried to drown it out with music, with the TV, with the hum of my kitchen appliances, but nothing works. The house is waiting. I don't know for what, and I don't know how much longer I can ignore it. The train was late, by 47 minutes, to be exact. I was standing on the platform with a lukewarm coffee in one hand and a paperback in the other, fully immersed in a chapter I'd already read 3 times. Behind me, a group of teenagers were debating whether ghosts could text, and a businessman was arguing loudly with someone on his phone about leverage. It wasn't shaping up to be a particularly memorable morning. Then I heard someone say, "Excuse me, could you hold this?" I turned, and a woman about my age was standing there, holding out a potted plant. Not a small one, either. This thing was at least 2 feet tall, with glossy leaves and a terracotta pot that looked like it weighed as much as a toddler. Her other arm was balancing a duffel bag and a pair of shoes tied together by their laces. She looked like she'd been mid-sprint when she decided she needed help. Sure," I said, setting my coffee on the ground to take the plant. It was heavier than I expected, and the pot wobbled dangerously. She let out a relieved sigh and immediately started digging through her duffel bag. "Thanks," she said, her voice muffled as she rummaged. "I think I have a granola bar in here somewhere. Or maybe an orange. God, I hope it's not squished. Are you okay?" I asked, because that felt like the polite thing to say to someone on the verge of a granola-related crisis. "Define okay," she said, finally pulling out what appeared to be half a granola bar wrapped in foil. "I missed my train. I'm on no sleep, and now I'm carrying a plant I didn't even want." She unwrapped the granola bar and took a bite. "So yeah, totally thriving." I glanced at the plant. "You don't want it?" She shook her head. "It's not mine. My roommate dumped it on me this morning. Said she couldn't take it with her to Ecuador. Apparently, it's emotionally significant, whatever that means." I couldn't help but laugh. "So you're stuck babysitting a plant?" "More like adopting," she said, giving it a side eye like it had personally wronged her. "I don't even know what kind it is. For all I know, it could be poisonous." I looked closer at the plant. "Pretty sure it's a monstera," I said. "They're not poisonous, but they do get huge." "Great," she said flatly. "So now I'm raising a monster." "Monstera," I corrected, and she cracked a smile. The train finally arrived with a low groan of brakes, and I handed the plant back to her as we boarded. She found a seat near the window, and I sat across from her, mostly because I was curious. The plant took up most of her lap, its leaves swaying precariously every time the train hit a bump. "So," I said after a minute, "what's the plan? Are you keeping it?" "Not a chance," she said. "I'm just hauling it to my mom's house. She loves this kind of thing. Her whole kitchen looks like a greenhouse." "Your mom doesn't mind inheriting random plants?" "She'll pretend it's an honor. She'll name it and give it a better life than I ever could," she said, brushing a strand of hair out of her face. "And then she'll guilt me about how I never visit enough to see it." I laughed, and she leaned back in her seat, finally looking less like someone bracing for a fight with gravity. "What about you?" she asked. "What's your excuse for being on this disaster of a train?" "No excuse," I said. "Just visiting a friend. She lives in the city." "That sounds suspiciously normal," she said, narrowing her eyes like I might be lying. "I'm a suspiciously normal person," I replied, and for some reason, that made her laugh harder than it should have. Over the next hour, as the train rattled its way through small towns and fields that blurred into one another, I learned her name was Mira. She worked as a freelance photographer, though she claimed most of her recent gigs involved taking pictures of other people's pets because they don't know how to use portrait mode. She told me about her roommate's impulsive decision to move to South America to find herself, and the chaos it had left behind. Unpaid bills, forgotten mail, and the monstera, which Mira had tried to pawn off on 2 neighbors and a very reluctant delivery driver before giving up. In return, I told her about my job, which was less interesting, and my friend in the city, who'd recently started a kombucha business out of her garage and had invited me to help with taste testing. Mira wrinkled her nose. "Kombucha tastes like regret," she said, and I couldn't argue with her. At one point, The train stalled on a bridge for 20 minutes, and we ended up playing a game where we tried to name as many bands as we could that had food-related names. When she got to Smashing Pumpkins, she tilted the Monstera toward me and said, "This is our new band mascot." By the time the train pulled into the station, the Monstera had been unofficially named Kevin, and Mira had decided that she might keep him after all. "Maybe he's my emotional support plant," she joked as we stepped onto the platform. "You know, for when life gets overwhelming." "Seems like a good role for Kevin," I said. "He's pretty sturdy." She smiled, and for a second, I thought she was about to say something else. But then her phone buzzed, and she glanced at the screen. "My mom's here," she said, hoisting the Monstera onto her hip like a toddler. "Guess I'll see if Kevin survives the next 24 hours. "Well, good luck," I said, trying to sound casual even though I didn't really want this weird little train ride to end. "And tell Kevin I'm rooting for him." She laughed, and then she was gone, weaving through the crowd with Kevin's leaves bobbing behind her like a flag. For weeks after that, I kept thinking about her. Not just Mira, but the absurdity of the whole situation. How one missed train and a second-hand plant had turned a mundane morning into something I couldn't stop replaying in my head. Then, one day, I got a text from a number I didn't recognize. It was a picture of Kevin, now perched proudly on a windowsill, with a caption that read, "He's thriving. And so am I. Hope you're doing the same." I never figured out how she got my number, but I texted back, and we started talking. About plants, about kombucha, about everything and nothing. And maybe it wasn't the kind of story you'd read in a novel, but it was ours, and it was enough. Have you ever had a moment so small and random that it changed everything? I'd been walking the same path to work for years, so long that I could practically sleepwalk through the routine. It wasn't scenic, just a stretch of cracked sidewalk that ran parallel to a chain-link fence, beyond which lay a row of graffiti-covered warehouses. The fence itself was overgrown with vines and weeds in summer, but in winter, it was just a skeleton, the frost clinging to the metal like a second skin. The kind of place you pass through without looking too hard at anything, because there's nothing worth noticing. At least, that's what I thought. One morning, just as the sky was softening from gray to pale blue, something caught my eye. I was halfway down the stretch of sidewalk when I noticed it, a small, tattered piece of paper snagged on the fence. Normally, I wouldn't have given it a second glance, but there was something strange about the way it moved. The wind wasn't tugging it loose, it was pulling it inward, as if the fence was trying to keep it. I slowed down, hesitating, before curiosity got the better of me. The paper looked old, yellowed at the edges, the corners soft from exposure. It was folded neatly, as though whoever had left it there wanted someone to find it. My fingers were stiff from the cold as I pulled it free, brushing off the dirt clinging to its surface. When I unfolded it, I realized it wasn't blank. There were words scrawled across the page in uneven handwriting. "If you're reading this, the door is open." I stared at it for a long moment, trying to make sense of the message. The door? What door? I glanced up and down the street, but the warehouses were all locked up tight, their metal doors secured with rusted chains and padlocks. The only thing remotely resembling a door was a narrow gate in the chain-link fence, about 20 feet ahead of me. I'd passed it 100 times before without giving it a second thought. It was always locked, a rusted padlock hanging from it like a dare. But now, as I looked at it, I realized the padlock was gone. The gate was slightly ajar. I don't know why I felt compelled to push it open. I had no reason to be late for work, no logical reason to follow the pull of something so strange. But I did it anyway. The hinges groaned as I stepped through, and I expected to be met with the empty lot behind the warehouses, the same bleak expanse I'd seen every day for years. Instead, I found myself standing in a garden. It didn't make sense. The garden wasn't just unexpected, it was impossible. Rows of wildflowers bloomed in chaotic bursts of color, despite the frost that coated the ground. A narrow cobblestone path wound its way through the space, leading to a small, circular clearing in the middle. There was a bench there, an old one with peeling paint and iron arms shaped like vines, and sitting on the bench was a woman. She looked up when she saw me, her expression unreadable. She was wearing a long coat that seemed to blend into the colors of the garden, and her hair was tucked under a wide-brimmed hat, the kind you'd expect to see in an old photograph. She didn't say anything at first, just tilted her head slightly, as though sizing me up. "I didn't think anyone would actually come," she said finally. Her voice was soft but steady, carrying just enough weight to keep me rooted in place. "I found this," I said, holding up the piece of paper like a shield. She smiled faintly, almost to herself. "I know. I left it. I didn't know how to respond to that. What is this place?" She gestured to the bench, inviting me to sit. "It's not really a place," she said as I hesitated. "Not in the way you're thinking. It's more a moment. One that doesn't belong to the world outside." "A moment," I repeated, sinking slowly onto the bench. The cobblestones were slick underfoot, but the air felt strangely warm, like the garden was shielding itself from the cold outside. She nodded. "It only shows up when it's needed, and only for the people who need it." I wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it, but something about her tone stopped me. Instead, I asked, "Why me?" She shrugged, leaning back on the bench. "That's for you to figure out." We sat in silence for a while, the kind of silence that feels like it's been waiting for you, patient and unyielding. I looked around the garden, trying to memorize the way the flowers seemed to shimmer under the weak morning light, the way the cobblestones felt uneven under my boots. I wanted to ask her more questions: who she was, how she'd found this place, how any of this was possible. But the words stuck in my throat. Eventually, she stood, brushing off her coat. "You can stay as long as you like," she said, "but you can't come back. That's the rule." "Wait," I said, standing quickly. "I don't understand. What am I supposed to do?" She looked at me for a long moment, her expression softening just enough to let something like sympathy slip through. "You're already doing it," she said. And then she was gone, disappearing down a path I hadn't noticed before, her coat blending into the garden until I couldn't tell where she ended and the flowers began. I stayed in the garden for what felt like hours, though it couldn't have been more than a few minutes. The air was warm and still, and for the first time in years, I felt like I wasn't in a hurry. There was no clock ticking in the back of my mind, no sense of the world pulling me in 1,000 directions at once, just the garden and the moment and the quiet. When I finally stepped back through the gate, the cold hit me like a slap. I turned to look behind me, but the garden was gone. All that was left was the empty lot, just as bleak and lifeless as it had always been. The piece of paper was still in my hand, but when I unfolded it again, the words had changed. "Now," it said, "don't forget." I tucked it into my pocket and started walking, my breath fogging in the cold morning air. The train was coming. I could hear it in the distance, the rumble of steel on steel. I didn't know what the note meant, or why the garden had appeared for me, or what I was supposed to do with the strange weight that now settled in my chest. All I knew was that, for the first time in years, the path to work didn't feel quite so ordinary. The package showed up on a Tuesday. I remember this because Tuesdays are the days I don't expect anything. No bills, no Amazon orders, no newsletters masquerading as envelopes marked important. Just a dead space in the week. And yet, there it was. A small brown box sitting on my doorstep when I came home from work, addressed to me in handwriting I didn't recognize. It was unremarkable at first glance. No return address, no shipping label, just my name, written in black ink, the letters neat but oddly precise. Like whoever wrote it had gone over each stroke twice to make sure it was just right. I picked it up, expecting it to be light, but it was heavier than I thought, like there was something dense inside. I stood there for a moment, holding it, trying to remember if I'd ordered anything, or if someone had mentioned sending me a gift. Nothing came to mind. That, in itself, wasn't entirely unusual. People forget things. Packages get misdelivered. It happens. But this one felt different. I brought it inside, set it on the kitchen counter, and stared at it. Something about it made me uneasy, though I couldn't put my finger on why. It wasn't ticking, at least, so I figured it wasn't a bomb. That was my first irrational thought, followed closely by the idea that it might be a prank. But I don't really know anyone who would bother pranking me, let alone with a package. After a few minutes of mental back and forth, I grabbed a knife and sliced through the tape. Inside was a single item, an old pocket knife. It was beautiful, in that worn, understated way that only objects with real history seem to carry. The wooden handle was smooth and dark with age, the blade slightly tarnished but still sharp enough to catch the light. There was no brand name or maker's mark, but there was an engraving on the handle, 3 small letters, carved with such precision they almost looked machine-made. IVS. I turned it over in my hands, half expecting to find some kind of note or explanation in the box, but there was nothing else. Just the knife, sitting there like it had been waiting for me. I didn't know what to do with it. I didn't collect knives. I didn't even use the ones I already owned. Unless you count the dull kitchen knife I relied on to awkwardly chop vegetables. But there was something about this one that made me hesitate to put it down. It felt solid in my hand, heavier than it looked, as though it was trying to anchor me in place. By the time I went to bed that night, I'd convinced myself it was probably just a mistake. Someone must have sent it to the wrong address, or maybe there was a mix-up at the post office. I decided I'd take it to the nearest post office in the morning and ask if they could trace it. But when I woke up, the knife wasn't where I'd left it. I'd put it on the kitchen counter. I was sure of that. But when I went to look for it, it wasn't there. Instead, it was sitting on my nightstand, right next to my alarm clock, as though someone, or something, had moved it while I was asleep. My first thought was that I was losing my mind. Maybe I'd moved it myself and just didn't remember. But the idea didn't sit right. I wasn't the type to carry random objects around the house and forget about it. I picked it up, my fingers brushing over the engraving on the handle. IVS. The letters felt rough against my skin, like they'd been cut deeper than they looked. Something about the knife stuck with me that day. I couldn't focus at work, my mind wandering back to it every few minutes. When I finally got home, I found myself sitting on the couch, holding it, running my thumb along the blade like I was trying to make sense of it. That's when I noticed the smallest nick near the base of the blade. It wasn't obvious, but if you caught the light just right, you could see a tiny notch in the metal. It looked deliberate, like someone had used the knife to carve something sharp and precise. Curious, I grabbed a piece of paper and pressed the blade against it, dragging it across the surface. The cut it left was flawless, a perfect line that felt more like a tear in the fabric of the world than a simple slice through paper. And then I saw it. The nick in the blade wasn't just a random imperfection. It was a pattern, a tiny, intricate symbol, etched so faintly into the metal that it was nearly invisible. A spiral. I stared at it, my pulse quickening. It was the kind of spiral that draws you in without trying, the kind that feels both infinite and claustrophobic at the same time. The more I looked at it, the more I felt like it was moving, shifting, pulling me closer to something I couldn't quite see. That night, I dreamed about the knife. In the dream, I was standing in the middle of a forest. The trees were impossibly tall, their branches tangled together to form a canopy so dense that no light could break through. I was holding the knife, the blade glowing faintly in the dark, and in front of me was a door. It wasn't a normal door. It looked ancient, made of wood so black it seemed to absorb the light from the blade. There was no handle, no hinges, just a single spiral carved into the center, the same as the one on the knife. I pressed the blade to the spiral, and the door opened. When I woke up, I was sitting upright in bed, the knife in my hand. I had no memory of getting up to grab it. The package had no return address, no note, no explanation. And yet, every time I hold the knife, I feel like it knows me, like it's been waiting for me. I haven't told anyone about it. How could I? It sounds insane, but part of me can't stop wondering, who sent it, and why? And most of all, what's behind that door? Have you ever felt like something found you? Not the other way around? Like it was meant to cross your path, even though you didn't ask for it? Something that feels both like a gift and a warning, all at once. There's a vending machine on the corner of 5th and Ash, tucked against the side of an old brick building. It doesn't look like much. One of those old, clunky ones with a faded Coca-Cola logo and a coin slot that always seems too stiff to work. The glass front is scratched and cloudy, and most of the buttons are so worn you can barely see the numbers. I'd walked past it 100 times without a second thought. It wasn't until last week, when I was caught in a sudden downpour and ducked into the alcove to get out of the rain, that I noticed the machine wasn't selling soda at all. The slots were filled with, well, it's hard to describe. Tiny jars of amber liquid labeled Morning after regret, little envelopes marked missed opportunities, a pack of gum called Words I Wish I'd Said. There was a single can on the top shelf that read "One more minute with him." The prices were absurdly low, 50 cents, $1, maybe $2 at the most. At first, I thought it was some kind of art installation, one of those quirky urban things that gets posted on Instagram for a week before disappearing entirely. But when I stepped closer, I realized there was no plaque or sign, no clever tagline or hashtag, just the vending machine, humming softly like it had always been there. I had 50 cents in my pocket. Out of pure curiosity, I slid the coins into the stiff slot and pressed the button for second chances. There was a metallic clunk, and the machine spat out a small, silver key. No note, no explanation, just the key, resting cold and heavy in the palm of my hand. I stood there for a long time, turning it over, waiting for something to happen. Nothing did. The rain eventually let up, and I walked home, the key in my pocket, wondering what kind of marketing stunt I'd just fallen for. That night, I left the key on my nightstand and went to bed, chalking the whole thing up to one of those odd little moments life throws at you. But the next morning, when I reached for my alarm clock, the key wasn't there. In its place was a small white envelope, sealed with a red wax stamp. My name was written on it, in handwriting I didn't recognize. Inside was a single photograph. It was a picture of me, standing on the boardwalk by the pier in my hometown, smiling at someone just outside the frame. I recognized the moment immediately. It was from 5 years ago, the last time I saw Claire before she moved away. I hadn't even thought about that day in years, but there it was, crystal clear, like a memory plucked out of my head and printed on glossy paper. On the back of the photo, in the same unfamiliar handwriting, were the words, "You'll know what to do." I didn't know what to do. I spent the entire day carrying the photo around, flipping it over, trying to make sense of it. By evening, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my coat and went back to the vending machine. It was still there, humming softly, the glass as scratched and cloudy as before. The items inside had changed, though. Now there were things like lost laughs, the smell of summer rain, and the courage to say no. I felt like a fool, but I fed 2 more quarters into the machine and pressed the button for closure. This time, it dispensed a small black notebook, the kind you might use for journaling. The cover was blank, and when I flipped through it, every page was empty except for the last one. Written there, in that same mysterious handwriting, was a single word, tomorrow. The next morning, there was another envelope on my nightstand. This time, it contained a train ticket to my hometown. No return ticket, no explanation, just a one-way pass. By this point, I'd stopped questioning it. Some part of me, the part that still believed in gut instincts and signs from the universe, told me to follow this wherever it led. So I packed a bag and went. When I got to the train station, it was exactly as I remembered it. Small, a little rundown, with the smell of diesel and old coffee hanging in the air. I didn't have a plan, but as I stepped onto the platform, I heard someone call my name. I turned, and there she was, Claire. She looked almost the same as she had 5 years ago, just a little older, a little softer around the edges. She smiled at me, and for a moment, it felt like no time had passed at all. "I had a feeling you'd show up," she said, like this was the most natural thing in the world. We spent the whole day walking around the town, talking about everything and nothing. She told me about her life in the city, the art gallery she was running, the boyfriend she'd just broken up with. I told her about my job, my apartment, my dog who was always stealing socks. It wasn't until the sun was setting, and we were standing on the same boardwalk from the photograph, that I realized what the vending machine had given me. It wasn't closure, exactly. It wasn't a second chance or a clean slate. It was an opportunity to rewrite the ending of a story I hadn't even realized was unfinished. I didn't know how the vending machine worked, or why it had chosen me, but in that moment, I didn't care. I just looked at Claire, the last rays of sunlight catching in her hair, and said the words I'd wanted to say 5 years ago but hadn't been brave enough to. "I never stopped thinking about you." Her smile faltered for just a second, like she wasn't sure how to respond. But then she reached out and took my hand, and that was enough. I went back to the vending machine one last time when I got home. It was gone. The corner where it had stood was empty. The brick wall bare except for a faint rectangle of cleaner mortar where it had leaned. I don't know where it went or who's finding it now, but I hope it's helping someone the way it helped me. And now, I have to ask, if you found a vending machine like that, what would you buy? What's the one thing you'd reach for if you thought it might actually give it to you? The first thing Layla noticed about the stranger was the way he stepped into the diner, as if he were testing the weight of the world under his boots. He hesitated at the door, his eyes scanning the place with the wariness of someone who had spent too much time running from things he couldn't explain. The clock above the counter ticked, loud and deliberate, as he chose a booth in the far corner, near the emergency exit. Layla wiped her hands on her apron and walked over, her pen poised above her notepad. Coffee? He looked up, and for a moment, she thought he might say something else entirely. Instead, he nodded, his voice a low rumble. Black. Thanks. She turned to leave, but his voice stopped her. Wait, can you tell me the name of this town? Layla frowned. Well, you're in Horizon. Though, if you took a wrong turn, that's not hard to do. There's a lot of nothing out here. He nodded again, as if the name confirmed something he'd been dreading. Layla delivered his coffee and didn't expect him to stay long, but an hour passed, then two. He didn't touch the coffee after the first sip, and his gaze kept shifting to the windows, watching the highway as though it might rear up and swallow him whole. The regulars came and went. Hank, who always ordered his eggs scrambled. Julia, who couldn't seem to get through breakfast without calling her sister to complain about her husband. Layla served them all with the same practiced smile, but she kept glancing back at the man in the corner. He didn't have the look of a drifter. His coat was too clean, his boots too new, and yet there was something unplaceable about him, something unsettled. It was almost closing time when the lights flickered. Layla looked up, startled, as the fluorescence buzzed and dimmed before stabilizing again. The man in the corner straightened, his hand gripping the edge of the table. Storm coming? Layla asked, trying to sound casual. The man didn't answer. He stood abruptly, pulling a small object from his coat pocket. It looked like a compass, but the needle inside spun wildly, pointing nowhere. He muttered something under his breath, and Layla stepped closer. You okay? He turned to her, and for the first time, she saw the fear in his eyes. You should leave, he said, his voice urgent. Now. Layla blinked. Excuse me? Go home. Lock your doors. Forget you ever saw me. The diner went silent. Even the clock above the counter seemed to hold its breath. Look, Layla said, trying to keep her voice steady. I don't know what your deal is, but you can't just... The lights went out. In the darkness, the man swore. Layla fumbled for the flashlight she kept under the counter, but before she could grab it, a deep, resonant hum filled the room. It wasn't a sound so much as a vibration, pressing into her chest and rattling her ribs. The windows trembled, and somewhere outside, a car alarm wailed before cutting off abruptly. The emergency lights flickered on, bathing the diner in a dim red glow. The man was already at the window, peering out into the night. Damn it, he muttered. It's too late. What's too late? Layla demanded, her fear turning into anger. What's going on? He turned to her, and his expression was a mix of resignation and something she couldn't quite name. You're about to find out. Before she could respond, the windows shattered inward, and a rush of cold air swept through the diner. The hum grew louder, more insistent, as shadows spilled across the floor like ink, pooling and twisting into shapes that defied logic. Layla stumbled back, her heart hammering in her chest. The shadows rose, forming into figures, tall, angular, with limbs that stretched and bent like branches in a storm. Their eyes glowed faintly, pale orbs that seemed to see through her. One of them tilted its head, its movements unervingly deliberate, and pointed at the man. Found you, it said, its voice a discordant echo. The man didn't flinch. He raised the compass-like device, and the needle stilled, pointing directly at the shadowy figure. I told you not to follow me, he said, his tone laced with defiance. You don't belong here, the figure replied. Its voice seemed to resonate inside Layla's skull, and she clutched her head, trying to block it out. Come with us, or... The man didn't let it finish. He twisted the device in his hand, and a pulse of light erupted from it, blinding and hot. The shadow figures recoiled, their forms flickering like dying flames. The hum faltered, and for a moment, silence returned. Layla crouched behind the counter, her breath coming in short gasps. When the light faded, the man was standing alone in the middle of the diner. The shadows were gone, but the air still felt charged, heavy with the weight of something unseen. "What the hell just happened?" she demanded, her voice trembling. The man turned to her, his expression unreadable. "You were in the wrong place at the wrong time. That's all." "That's all?" she repeated, her voice rising. "You come in here, act all cryptic, and then that happens? You owe me an explanation." He hesitated, then sighed. "They're called echoes. They're drawn to people like me." "People like you?" "People who don't belong," he said simply. He tucked the device back into his coat and moved toward the door. "Wait," Layla called after him. "What happens if they come back?" He paused, his hand on the doorframe. "They won't. Not here." He glanced back at her, his eyes softer now. "You should forget this. Go back to your life." "And you?" she asked. He didn't answer. The door swung shut behind him, and Layla was left standing in the red glow of the emergency lights, the shattered windows letting in the cold night air. The clock above the counter started ticking again. It wasn't my first time walking through the underpass. There was nothing special about it, just a long, graffiti-streaked tunnel beneath the train tracks. The air always smelled faintly of damp concrete, and the occasional drip from some mysterious leak would echo as I passed. It was one of those places you barely notice, a transitional space that existed purely to get you from one side of the tracks to the other. But that day, something stopped me. Not a person, not a sound, just a tiny patch of color on the ground. At first, I thought it was trash. It was about the size of a coaster, lying there in a puddle, almost swallowed by the grime. A disc, maybe, with edges chipped and paint faded. But something about it made me crouch down, curiosity outweighing the cold discomfort of my knees pressing against wet concrete. I picked it up and tilted it toward the faint light spilling in from the ends of the tunnel. It wasn't just a disc. It was a pog slammer. The weight of it in my hand hit me harder than the actual object. It was made of metal, worn down at the edges like it had been thrown 1,000 times. The design on its surface, a snarling cartoon wolf surrounded by jagged purple flames, was barely visible through years of scratches. But I knew what it was, and as I stood there holding it, the world shifted. I was 10 years old again, sitting cross-legged on the linoleum floor of my elementary school cafeteria. My backpack was unzipped and spilling over with plastic pogs, bright cardboard circles stamped with every design you could imagine, from skulls to smiley faces to that weird, ever-present yin-yang symbol that everyone seemed obsessed with back then. The slammer in my hand now was a dead ringer for the one I used to have. That cafeteria floor was our battlefield. We'd huddle in tight circles, stacks of pogs piled high between us, our voices rising and falling with each turn. Someone would slam their disc against the stack, the pogs scattering across the floor in a chaotic explosion. Whatever landed face up, you gotta keep. The thrill was equal parts skill and chaos, and losing was just as addictive as winning. I remembered the way my heart raced whenever I held my slammer, the weight of it promising something dramatic with every throw. But more than the game, I remembered the people. My best friend at the time, Eric, always had the flashiest pogs, the ones with holographic designs that shimmered under the flickering cafeteria lights. He never let on where he got them, though we all suspected he had a secret stash at home, maybe handed down by an older cousin. There was Olivia, who played cautiously, lining up her shots with an almost scientific precision, and Javier, who would slam his disc so hard we thought he might break the floor one day. We were warriors then, our reputations built on cardboard circles and metal slammers. We traded, fought, and hoarded like our lives depended on it. And then, one day, the game was gone. Just gone. One week, the cafeteria was full of us and our makeshift tournaments, and the next, the school bandit. Some parent had complained about gambling, or maybe it was just the mess we left behind. spilled stacks of pogs, and the occasional crying kid whose prized piece had been claimed in a risky game. Whatever the reason, it ended abruptly, and we scattered, taking our pogs and our slammers back to wherever we'd gotten them. I can't remember what happened to mine. Maybe they ended up in a shoebox somewhere, forgotten and eventually thrown out. But standing there in the underpass, holding that chipped slammer in my hand, it felt like I'd reached through time and touched something I thought was gone forever. The funny thing was, I couldn't figure out why it was there. Who had left it? Had some other grown-up been walking through this tunnel, the slammer falling from their pocket like a breadcrumb of childhood? Or had it been dropped years ago, unnoticed and untouched until now? I couldn't shake the strangeness of finding it in such an unremarkable place, as if it had been waiting for me. I slipped it into my coat pocket and kept walking, the metal cool and heavy against my fingertips. But something had changed. The underpass felt different, like it wasn't just a tunnel anymore but a portal, a quiet space where the past could slip through the cracks and find you. When I got home, I put the slammer on my kitchen counter and stared at it for a long time. It looked even smaller under the bright lights, but it still carried the weight of those cafeteria days, of the friendships forged and forgotten, of the way time can sneak up on you and steal pieces of yourself without you noticing. Later that night, I found myself searching online for vintage pogs. I didn't know what I was looking for exactly. Maybe something that matched the ones I used to have, or maybe just proof that they still existed in some corner of the world. What I found surprised me. There were hundreds of them for sale, whole collections being auctioned off like relics of a lost civilization. But as I scrolled through page after page of brightly colored discs, I realized something. It wasn't the pogs I missed. It wasn't even the game. It was the feeling, the reckless joy of throwing yourself into something ridiculous and fleeting. The certainty that every throw mattered even though the stakes were nothing more than a handful of cardboard. It was the people I played with, the shared laughter, the arguments over whether a pog had really flipped or if someone had nudged it. It was being a kid, in all its absurd, chaotic glory. The slammer still sits on my counter. I don't know what to do with it yet. Maybe I'll keep it there as a reminder, or maybe I'll slip it into my pocket one day and leave it somewhere else. A park bench, a library shelf, someplace where someone else might find it and feel that same spark of recognition. Has anything ever found you like that? Something small, something almost forgotten, that brought back a piece of yourself you didn't even realize was missing? When I was 9 years old, I buried a toaster in the woods behind my house. It wasn't broken. It wasn't even old. In fact, it was a perfectly good toaster, sleek, shiny, and the kind of thing you'd see in a catalog with the caption, "Modern Kitchen Must-Have." But to me, it felt dangerous, almost alive, and I wanted it gone. I should back up a bit. The toaster had been a Christmas gift from my Aunt Gloria, who always gave my parents these wildly impractical presents. One year, it was a chocolate fondue fountain we never used. Another year, a crystal decanter set that my dad promptly turned into a display for loose change. This time, it was the toaster, a 4-slot, chrome-plated monstrosity that practically hummed with self-importance. My mom loved it. She even got rid of our old toaster, the trusty beige one that had been around since before I was born, to make space for this new marvel of engineering. But from the moment we plugged it in, something felt off. The first time I used it, I was making Pop-Tarts after school. I slid them into the slots, pressed the lever down, and waited. The toaster hummed faintly, its surface gleaming under the fluorescent kitchen light. And then, just as the Pop-Tarts were supposed to pop up, the toaster made this sound. Not a mechanical ding or a metallic click, but something low and guttural, like a deep, raspy breath. I jumped back, nearly knocking over a glass of milk. The toaster stayed still, the red coils inside glowing faintly. The Pop-Tarts popped up a second later, perfectly toasted, but I couldn't shake the sound I'd heard. I told my mom about it, but she waved me off. "It's just the heating element," she said, as if that explained anything. My dad mumbled something about new appliances being weird, and that was the end of the conversation. But the sound wasn't the only thing. Over the next few weeks, I started to notice other strange things about the toaster. Sometimes, when it was plugged in, the lights in the kitchen would flicker. Other times, I'd walk past it and swear I felt heat radiating off it, even though no one had used it for hours. Once, when I was emptying the dishwasher, I saw my reflection in its chrome surface, and for a split second, my reflection didn't match what I was doing. I tried to avoid it after that. I'd eat cereal instead of toast, make sandwiches instead of bagels, but my parents kept using it like nothing was wrong. Every morning, my mom would make her toast, spreading peanut butter on it with the same casual ease as if she were handling any other appliance. Then, one night, I woke up to the smell of burning. At first, I thought it was a dream, but the smell was sharp and acrid, like plastic melting. I stumbled out of bed, rubbing my eyes, and followed the scent downstairs. The kitchen was dark, except for the faint red glow coming from the toaster. It was on. No one else was awake. My parents were asleep in their room, and the house was silent except for the faint hum of the toaster. Its slots were empty, but the coils inside burned brightly, casting long shadows on the counter. I stood there for what felt like forever, my heart pounding in my chest. I thought about unplugging it, but something in me, some deep, primal instinct, told me not to touch it. Instead, I grabbed a dish towel, threw it over the toaster, and backed out of the kitchen. The next morning, the toaster was off. The dish towel was folded neatly next to it, as if someone had taken it off and put it away. My parents didn't mention anything, and I didn't dare bring it up. That's when I decided it had to go. The woods behind our house weren't very big, just a small patch of trees that separated our neighborhood from the next one over. But to a 9-year-old, they felt endless. I waited until my parents were distracted one Saturday afternoon, then snuck the toaster out of the kitchen and into the woods. I didn't have a plan beyond getting rid of it. I found a spot near a cluster of moss-covered rocks and started digging with a rusty garden trowel I'd found in the shed. The ground was cold and stubborn, but I didn't stop until I'd made a hole big enough for the toaster. When I finally dropped it in, it landed with a dull thunk. I stared at it for a moment, half expecting it to do something. Light up, make a noise, anything. But it just sat there, gleaming faintly in the dappled sunlight. I covered it with dirt, packed it down with my hands, and ran back home. For weeks, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd made a mistake. Every time I walked past the woods, I'd glance toward the trees, half expecting to see the toaster sitting there, waiting for me. I even had nightmares about it, dreams where I'd wake up to find it plugged in on the kitchen counter, its coils glowing red. But as time passed, the dreams stopped, and the feeling of dread faded. We got a new toaster, a cheap, 2-slot model from the hardware store, and life went back to normal. I almost forgot about the whole thing. Almost. Years later, when I was home from college, I decided to take a walk in the woods. It was more out of nostalgia than anything else. I hadn't been back there since I was a kid. The trees were thinner than I remembered, the paths narrower, but I found my way to the spot where I'd buried the toaster. The ground was undisturbed, the moss-covered rocks exactly where I'd left them. But as I stood there, I felt a faint warmth beneath my feet, like the earth itself was radiating heat. I don't know what I expected. A sign? A noise? A hand reaching up from the dirt? But nothing happened. I walked back home, trying to convince myself it was all in my head. That night, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard it again. The low, guttural sound I hadn't heard in years. And this time, it wasn't coming from the kitchen. So here's my question. Have you ever tried to get rid of something, a thought, an object, a memory, only to realize it never really left? And if so, what did you do when it came back? The cat showed up at Amelia's door on the first frost of the year. It was gray with mismatched eyes, one amber, the other a pale blue that bordered on white. She might have ignored it if it hadn't been for the peculiar fact that it knocked, not pawing at the door or scratching, but knocking, as if it had watched humans long enough to imitate them. Amelia hesitated, her hand hovering above the knob. When she finally opened the door, the cat looked up at her with an expression that felt disturbingly human. It strolled inside without waiting for an invitation, its tail flicking as though it owned the place. "You're welcome," Amelia muttered, shutting the door against the icy wind. The cat didn't respond, of course, but it leapt onto the armrest of her couch and began grooming itself with methodical precision. She noticed then that it wasn't a normal stray. Its fur had a sheen like polished silver, and its claws, which glinted briefly as it licked them, looked unnervingly sharp. "All right," she said, hands on her hips. "You can stay the night. But no clawing the furniture, and no stealing my food." The cat paused mid-lick, glanced at her, and then resumed grooming. That night, Amelia dreamed of a forest she didn't recognize. It stretched endlessly in every direction, its trees ancient and twisted, their bark etched with strange symbols. A silver cat led her through the undergrowth, its eyes gleaming in the dark. She woke to the sensation of something heavy on her chest. The cat was sitting there, staring at her. "You have got to stop doing creepy things," she grumbled, shoving it off. It landed gracefully, not even slightly perturbed. Over the next week, Amelia tried to find its owner. She posted on community boards, asked her neighbors, and even took the cat to the vet to check for a chip. Nothing. Each time she left the house, the cat followed her to the door but never stepped outside. And each time she returned, it was waiting, as if it knew her schedule better than she did. It was on the 8th day that she found the note. It was tucked beneath a pile of unopened mail on her kitchen counter, written on parchment that smelled faintly of smoke. The handwriting was angular, almost like claw marks etched into the page. "Thank you for your hospitality. The debt is yours now." "What the hell is this?" she muttered, staring at the note. She looked around, but the cat wasn't in its usual spot on the couch. A cold draft swept through the kitchen, and when she turned, the back door was open. The cat stood just outside, its fur shimmering in the pale moonlight. "Did you do this?" she asked, stepping toward it. The cat didn't move but tilted its head, its blue eye catching the light like a shard of ice. Then it turned and darted into the woods that bordered her property. Against her better judgment, Amelia followed. The trees were unnervingly quiet, their bare branches clawing at the sky. The cat moved swiftly but always stayed within sight, pausing occasionally to make sure she was still following. The forest seemed to grow denser the farther they went, the air colder, until frost clung to every surface. "Where are you taking me?" she demanded, though she didn't expect an answer. Finally, they reached a clearing. In its center stood a circle of stones, each one etched with symbols that looked eerily similar to the ones she'd seen in her dream. The cat sat on the largest stone, its tail curling around its paws. For the first time, it made a sound. Not a meow, but something deeper, almost like a hum. The ground inside the circle began to glow faintly. Amelia stepped back, her heart pounding. "I didn't sign up for this," she whispered. The glow intensified, and the air grew heavy, pressing against her chest. A figure began to take shape in the circle, rising from the earth as though it had been buried there. It was tall, humanoid, but wrong in ways that made her eyes ache. Its limbs were too long, its fingers ending in claws, and its face was a blank slate save for two burning points of light where its eyes should have been. "Who has summoned me?" the figure intoned, its voice reverberating through the clearing. Amelia glanced at the cat, who watched her impassively. Not me," she offered, her voice trembling. The figure turned its eyeless gaze toward her. "The debt is yours," it said. "It has been passed, as it always is." "What debt?" "I don't know anything," she protested. "You offered shelter," the figure replied. "You accepted the terms without understanding them. Now you carry the weight." Amelia's mouth went dry. "What does that even mean?" "You will learn," it said simply. Then it dissolved into the air, leaving the clearing silent once more. The cat jumped down from its perch and sauntered over to her, purring as it rubbed against her leg. Amelia stared at it, her mind racing. "You knew?" she accused. "You planned this." The cat looked up at her, blinking slowly, and for a moment, she thought she saw a flicker of amusement in its mismatched eyes. She trudged back to her house, the cat trotting beside her as if nothing had happened. The note was still on the counter when she returned, but now there were more words scrawled beneath the original message. "Do not let it linger. It always collects." Amelia stared at the cat, which had curled up on the couch, looking impossibly smug. "Great," she muttered. "Just great." When I opened my freezer, there was a man inside. Not frozen, mind you. He was very much alive, leaning casually against a bag of peas as though sitting in a freezer was the most natural thing in the world. He was wearing a wool coat, though it didn't seem like he needed it, and his hair was frosted white. Not from age, but from the cold, like he just walked through a snowstorm and decided to take up residence beside my frozen waffles. "Hey," he said, blinking up at me. His breath came out in little puffs of steam. "Do you mind shutting the door? You're letting the cold out." I slammed it shut. Then I opened it again. He was still there, looking slightly annoyed now. "Seriously, you're ruining the chill in here. Close the door." I shut it again, took a step back, and stared at the freezer as though it had betrayed me. For a moment, I thought I might be hallucinating. Long day? Weird dreams? Some kind of brain freeze in reverse? But I hadn't even had coffee yet, and my hallucinations usually weren't so chatty. Against my better judgment, I opened the freezer again. "Better," the man said, sitting cross-legged now on top of a tub of ice cream. "You're learning." "What? Who? Why are you in my freezer?" I finally managed to stammer. He raised an eyebrow. "Your freezer? That's bold of you to say. Ever think it might not just belong to you?" "Of course it belongs to me." I snapped. "It's in my kitchen." He mused, tapping a frost-covered finger against his chin. "Ownership is such a nebulous concept, though, isn't it? Is it yours because you bought it? Or because you use it? Or is it yours because you think it's yours? Why are you philosophizing in my freezer?" "Philosophizing is my job," he said, shrugging. "Or part of it, anyway. But this isn't about me, it's about you. Haven't you noticed something's off?" I frowned, crossing my arms. "What are you talking about?" He pointed a frosty finger at me, his gaze piercing. "Your freezer. Go on. Look at it." Against my better judgment, I did as he said, and as soon as I glanced back into the freezer, I noticed something strange. It wasn't a freezer at all anymore. The shelves of frozen vegetables and half-eaten pints of ice cream were gone. Instead, the space stretched endlessly, a shimmering landscape of frost and ice, with jagged peaks in the distance and a pale, silvery sky above. The air that wafted out wasn't just cold. It was ancient, thick with the kind of chill that belonged to forgotten glaciers and the edges of the world. "What the hell?" I breathed. The man gave me a sly smile. "You weren't paying attention, were you? Most people don't. They open their freezers, grab their leftover lasagna, and move on. No one ever asks what else might be inside." "What else?" I repeated, my voice rising in pitch. "It's a freezer. There's not supposed to be anything else." "And yet," he said, gesturing to the expanse of ice and frost. I took a step back, heart racing, but before I could bolt for the door, the man hopped down from the ice cream tub, now hovering inexplicably in midair, and gestured toward the horizon. "You can't leave now. Not when you've found it." "Found what?" I asked, though I already knew the answer would be ridiculous. "The threshold," he said, his voice softening. "It's not something you stumble across every day. Only people who need it ever find it." I frowned. "What are you talking about?" "Need what?" "An escape. A chance. A change." His eyes sparkled, as though he knew something I didn't. "You've been stuck, haven't you? Trapped in a routine, going through the motions, feeling like there's something missing but never quite able to put your finger on it. Well, here it is. The threshold. A door to possibilities." He stepped aside, gesturing grandly to the frozen landscape beyond. I stared at him, then at the icy expanse, and then back at him. "This is insane. It's just a weird, frozen dimension in my freezer. I don't need a change. I need my frozen pizza." "Do you?" he asked, cocking his head. "Or is that just what you've told yourself? Maybe you've convinced yourself that the pizza is enough, that you're content, that the freezer is just a freezer. But maybe, just maybe, you've been waiting for something to break the monotony. Something like this." I opened my mouth to argue, but the words caught in my throat, because, deep down, I knew he wasn't wrong. "What happens if I go in there?" I asked, finally. He smiled again, but there was something softer about it this time. "That's up to you. The threshold doesn't tell you what to do. It shows you the options. Paths you didn't know you could take. Some lead to wonder. Some lead to chaos. And some, his smile faltered, just slightly, some led back here. To the freezer. To your pizza. I hesitated, staring out at the shimmering expanse. The air that poured from it wasn't just cold. It was alive, electric, humming with possibility. And if I don't go? Then you shut the door, he said simply, and your freezer stays a freezer. Life goes on. Pizza, peas, lasagna, and all. My heart was pounding in my chest. Part of me wanted to slam the door shut, to lock it and throw the entire appliance out the window. But another part of me, a part one hadn't listened to in years, wanted to see what was out there. What's the catch? I asked, narrowing my eyes at him. He grinned. The catch is, you don't get to know how it ends. Not until you walk it. I looked back at the frozen horizon, my breath fogging in the air. What would you do? Would you step into the unknown? Or would you close the door and pretend you never saw it? I hadn't expected the river to be frozen. It hadn't been cold enough, not for long, and yet there it was, a wide ribbon of ice stretching between the banks, shining faintly under the last light of day. The bridge was out of sight by now. I'd veered off the main road after the afternoon snow flurries had given way to an eerie stillness. The kind of stillness that presses in around you, where even the trees seem to hold their breath. I didn't have a reason to follow the path that led down to the riverbank. I told myself it was just curiosity, or maybe boredom. But the truth was, I'd been feeling unmoored lately, and something about the narrow trail cutting through the trees had felt like an invitation. When I reached the edge of the river, the air was colder than it had been just moments before. Not sharp or biting, but dense, like it had been packed tighter somehow. A few feet away, a single set of footprints led out onto the ice, and I couldn't help but wonder about the person who'd left them. They were deep enough to suggest weight, deliberate and steady, as if whoever had crossed hadn't hesitated for a moment. The prints stopped about halfway across the river. Just stopped. No signs of a struggle, no indication that the ice had broken. Nothing. They simply ended, as if the person had vanished. I stood there for longer than I should have, the twilight fading into a dim, uncertain blue. A part of me wanted to turn back, to forget I'd seen anything at all. But another part of me, the part that had always been too curious for its own good, wanted to know. Against my better judgment, I stepped onto the ice. It held, solid and silent beneath my boots. The footprints were larger than mine, their edges slightly blurred by the wind, but still clear enough to follow. I walked slowly, each step accompanied by the faint sound of my breath in the still air. The world around me felt different out here, quieter and heavier, as if I'd crossed some invisible boundary without realizing it. When I reached the spot where the footprints ended, I stopped. The ice beneath me was smooth and unmarked, and the riverbank on the far side looked farther away than it should have. I glanced over my shoulder and felt my stomach drop. The way back seemed farther, too, like the distance had stretched while I wasn't looking. And then I heard it, a soft sound, just beneath the surface of the ice. Faint at first, almost imperceptible, but growing louder with each passing moment. It wasn't cracking or shifting, the kind of sounds you'd expect from a frozen river. It was melodic, rippling, like the faint notes of a song being played on a harp. I knelt down, pressing my gloved hand against the ice. It was warm. The song grew louder. I leaned closer, my breath fogging the surface, and that's when I saw it. A shape, blurry but unmistakable, moving beneath the ice. It was long and sinuous, gliding gracefully just beneath the surface. At first, I thought it was a fish, but it was far too large. Then I thought of an eel, but the movements were too fluid, too deliberate, like the creature was swimming to the rhythm of the song. I should have been afraid, but the sound, the music, it was pulling me in, drowning out every instinct to run. The thing in the ice stopped directly beneath me, its form sharpening just enough for me to see the faint outline of something that looked almost human. Not quite, though. Its arms were too long, its fingers webbed, and its face, though pale and framed by flowing hair, was wrong in ways I couldn't put into words. Its eyes locked onto mine, wide and dark, and the music swelled, filling my ears, my mind, my chest. The creature raised one hand and pressed it against the ice. Without thinking, I pressed my hand against the same spot. The warmth spread through me instantly, a wave of heat that melted the cold from my fingers and toes. The edges of the world blurred, and for a moment, I wasn't standing on the ice anymore. I was underwater, weightless, surrounded by faint glimmers of light that pulsed like stars. And then, just as suddenly, I was back on the river, gasping for air as if I'd been holding my breath. The music stopped. The creature was gone. I scrambled to my feet, the warmth fading from my body as quickly as it had come. The river was silent now, the ice beneath me smooth and undisturbed. The footprints were gone, too, swallowed by the surface as if they'd never been there at all. I ran back to the riverbank, not daring to look over my shoulder. When I reached the trail, I stopped and turned, expecting to see something, anything, that would make sense of what had just happened. But the river was empty, the ice unbroken, and the woods as quiet as they'd been before. I stood there for a long time, my breath coming in sharp bursts, my mind racing to piece together what I'd seen. And then, just as I was about to leave, I heard it again. The music, soft and faint, carried on the wind. I didn't go back, but I've thought about it every day since. Sometimes, late at night, I'll dream of that weightless place beneath the ice, the glimmering lights and the warmth that seemed to fill every corner of me. I'll wake up with the melody still ringing in my ears, and for a moment, I'll wonder if it's calling me back. I don't know what I'd do if it is. It wasn't until my toaster broke that I realized how much I depended on it. Not in the obvious, practical sense, we all know toasters toast things, but in a way that felt disturbingly emotional. It had been with me for 6 years, a wedding gift from someone whose name I couldn't remember anymore. I didn't even like toast that much, but the machine had become part of my routine, a silent co-conspirator in the tiny rhythm of my mornings. And then, one day, it simply stopped. No spark, no smoke, just silence. I pressed the lever down, and it popped back up immediately, like it had decided to quit its job with no notice. I didn't know what to do. I stood there in my kitchen, holding a slice of bread like an idiot, and stared at the toaster, as if maybe this was some kind of misunderstanding. It wasn't. It was dead. So I did what any rational adult would do. I opened my laptop and Googled, "Why does my toaster hate me?" Of course, the internet had no answers for my particular crisis, but it did lead me down a rabbit hole of toaster history. I learned that the first electric toaster was invented in 1893, that pop-up toasters didn't arrive until the 1920s, and that early models required you to stand by them and flip the bread manually. That's right, you had to babysit your toast. I sat there, staring at a photo of a 100-year-old toaster, and something about it hit me in a way I couldn't explain. The absurdity of it all. The way someone, somewhere, decided that bread needed to be improved and then devoted their life to solving that problem. It was so specific, so ridiculous, and yet undeniably brilliant. What kind of person looks at bread and thinks, "This is good, but what if it were crunchy?" For the next few days, I tried to live without a toaster. I roasted bread in the oven, which felt like overkill. I even attempted to fry it in a pan, but the result was more like a sad crouton. By the end of the week, I gave up and ordered a new one online. It arrived 2 days later, a sleek, stainless steel model that promised precision browning technology. I plugged it in, slid in a slice of bread, and stood there, waiting to see if it lived up to the hype. The toast came out perfect, evenly browned, golden, and crisp. But as I held it in my hand, I didn't feel the satisfaction I'd expected. Instead, I felt disloyal, like I'd replaced an old friend with a newer, shinier version of itself. I don't know why I felt that way. My old toaster didn't have feelings, and even if it did, it was a terrible toaster. But still, I couldn't shake the thought that I'd betrayed it somehow. That's when I decided I needed to get rid of the old one. Not just throw it away, but dispose of it. Give it a proper goodbye. I took it out to the garage and stared at it for a long time, sitting there on the floor next to the recycling bin. It looked smaller now, sadder, like a dog that had been left behind. For a brief, insane moment, I considered burying it in the backyard, like a pet. But then I remembered I live in a townhouse with no backyard, So I did the next best thing. I Googled creative ways to say goodbye to a toaster. Surprisingly, the internet had ideas. Someone suggested turning it into a planter, but I couldn't imagine explaining that to guests. "Oh, it's my toaster, Fern." Another person recommended using it as a time capsule, which seemed poetic, but I didn't know what to put inside. What do you put in a toaster time capsule? A slice of bread? A note that says, "In memory of better breakfasts"? Ultimately, I decided to take it to the local electronics recycling center. It wasn't glamorous, but it felt responsible. On the drive there, I found myself talking to the toaster, which was sitting in the passenger seat like an old friend catching a ride. "You were a good toaster," I said, feeling slightly ridiculous but unable to stop myself. "You weren't perfect, but you did your best." I don't know why I was being so sentimental. Maybe because it had been with me through so much. Lazy weekends, rushed mornings, late-night cravings. It was just a toaster, but it was my toaster. When I arrived at the recycling center, I hesitated. The man at the drop-off point gave me a bored look and held out his hand, but I wasn't ready. "Can I have a moment?" I asked, and he blinked at me like I was insane. I turned back to the toaster and gave it one last look. "Goodbye," I said quietly, and then handed it over. On the way home, I couldn't stop thinking about how strange it all was. This attachment to an object, this need to imbue it with meaning. It wasn't just the toaster either. I'd felt the same way when I'd retired my first pair of running shoes, the ones that had carried me through my first 5K, even though they were falling apart by the end. I'd felt it when I replaced my old, clunky phone with a sleek new model, even though the old one barely worked anymore. These things weren't alive, and yet they seemed to carry a piece of me with them, as if they'd absorbed my life through sheer proximity. That night, as I made toast in my new, guilt-inducing toaster, I thought about how much we surround ourselves with things. Objects that serve us, frustrate us, break down on us. We rely on them, take them for granted, and then, when they've outlived their usefulness, we cast them aside. It's a strange kind of relationship, isn't it? One-sided, transactional, but still deeply personal in a way I can't quite explain. I don't think I'll ever stop feeling this way about my things, this weird mix of gratitude and guilt. Maybe it's just part of being human, our tendency to project meaning onto the mundane. Or maybe it's something else, something I haven't quite figured out yet. All I know is that I'll probably feel the same when this new toaster eventually breaks, and I'll find myself standing in the kitchen, holding another slice of bread, wondering why I feel so sad about something so small. So now I'm curious. What's the most ridiculous thing you've ever felt attached to? Something small, ordinary, completely replaceable. But for some reason, it mattered anyway? The train was late, which was exactly the kind of thing I should have expected when I decided to take public transportation in the dead of winter. The station was a relic of a different era, built with good intentions and no regard for comfort. The benches were cold metal, and the floor was chip tile covered in a fine layer of dirt and slush. The wind blew straight through the gaps in the walls, cutting like a knife. It was miserable, but not miserable enough to justify a cab ride. Not yet. I was the only one waiting, which somehow made the whole place feel even colder. The timetable on the wall was outdated. The little snack kiosk was shuttered with a rusty padlock. All I could hear was the occasional hum of the overhead lights and the faint sound of cars on the street above. I shoved my hands deeper into my coat pockets, staring down the empty track, willing the train to appear. It didn't. That's when I noticed the vending machine. It was tucked into a corner near the far end of the platform, half hidden behind a pillar. The thing looked ancient, with faded decals and a cracked plastic front that revealed rows of snacks I hadn't seen in years. Candy bars and wrappers I thought they'd stopped making. Bags of chips with logos from decades ago. A pack of gum with a price sticker that read 35 cents. The whole machine looked like it had been pulled out of a time capsule and dumped there, waiting for someone to notice it. I walked over, more out of curiosity than anything else. The display screen was blank, and the buttons were sticky with grime, but it looked like it might still work. I fished a coin out of my pocket and dropped it into the slot. It clinked as it disappeared, and the machine hummed to life, the display flickering on. It wasn't a normal screen, though. Instead of showing a list of prices, it simply said, Make a selection. Something about the phrasing gave me pause, but I shrugged it off. I scanned the rows of snacks, my eyes landing on a pack of cookies near the top. They were the kind my grandmother used to buy, the kind that always tasted a little stale but in a way that made them better somehow. I pressed the corresponding button. The machine made a mechanical whirring noise, but nothing dropped into the tray. Instead, the screen flickered again. "Try again," it said. I frowned, pressing the button again. Same result. I tried another selection. A candy bar I remembered splitting with my cousin during a road trip when we were kids. Nothing. The machine hummed and whirred, but the snacks stayed put. Just as I was about to give up, the screen changed again. "Not what you're looking for." I froze. The words sat there, glowing faintly in the dim light of the station. It was a ridiculous thing to feel unsettled by. Obviously, the machine was broken, glitching out in some strange way. But there was something about the message that felt personal, like it was talking to me, not just malfunctioning. I pressed another button, this time at random. A pack of chips. The machine didn't even pretend to process the request. The screen immediately updated. "Look deeper." My heart skipped a beat. I glanced around, but the platform was still empty. The train was nowhere in sight, and the cold had settled into my bones. I looked back at the machine, unsure whether to walk away or keep going. "Deeper," I muttered under my breath, shaking my head. But before I could stop myself, I pressed one of the unlabeled buttons at the very bottom of the keypad. It didn't correspond to any snack in the display case, but I felt compelled to try it anyway. The machine clunked loudly, the kind of noise that made you wonder if it had just broken itself. I leaned down to look into the tray, half expecting it to be empty. But there was something there. Something that didn't belong. It wasn't a snack. It wasn't even something I recognized. It was a small, battered object wrapped in what looked like wax paper. I hesitated before picking it up, turning it over in my hands. It felt solid, heavier than I expected. When I unwrapped the paper, I found a little tin box underneath, the kind that might have once held mints or cough drops. There was a word etched into the lid, faint and barely legible. "Remember." I felt a strange chill that had nothing to do with the weather. My thumb traced the letters as I sat down on the nearest bench, still holding the box like it might vanish if I let go. I opened it slowly, the hinges creaking like they hadn't moved in years. Inside was a photograph. The edges were curled, the colors faded, but the image was unmistakable. It was a picture of me. Not me now. Me as a kid, standing in front of my grandparents' house. I was wearing a bright yellow raincoat, the one I used to insist on wearing even when it wasn't raining, and I was holding a stick in one hand, pointing it like a sword. My grandmother was in the background, sitting on the porch with a smile that could light up the whole world. I stared at the photo, my breath catching in my throat. I didn't remember this picture being taken. I didn't even remember the raincoat anymore, though now that I saw it, I could almost feel the weight of it on my shoulders. The warmth of summer evenings spent running around that yard, pretending I was some kind of knight. The sound of my grandmother's laughter when I tried to defend her from imaginary dragons. I flipped the photo over, and my stomach dropped. There was something written on the back in my grandmother's looping handwriting. Just 2 words. "Come home." The train arrived 5 minutes later, screeching to a stop with a rush of wind that made the world feel sharp again. I almost didn't get on. I almost stayed, staring at that vending machine, waiting for it to explain itself. But in the end, I boarded, the little tin box tucked into my coat pocket like a secret. I don't know what it meant, or how that photo ended up there. I don't even know if it was real. But the next day, I called my parents and told them I'd be visiting soon. They sounded surprised but happy, and I promised myself I'd dig through the old photo albums when I got there. Maybe I'd find the picture again. Maybe I wouldn't. All I know is this. Sometimes, life finds strange ways to remind you of what matters. And sometimes, a vending machine full of forgotten snacks can point you back to the places you didn't even realize you'd left behind.